You've probably seen it, the video, or the meme, or the cartoon that was everywhere a decade or so ago. A hand-sized animal in tropical water striking so fast the camera can't quite catch it, reducing a snail shell to dust, or just sitting there, impossibly colored, eyes on stalks, looking like something drawn by a child who hadn't yet learned what animals were supposed to look like. The cartoon, still most people's clearest introduction to this creature, explained that the mantis shrimp has 16 color receptors to our 3, throws the fastest punch in the natural world, and belongs, by any reasonable measure, in a category of its own. All of this has a basis, in fact. The strike is real. The color receptors are real. The animal is, on its own terms, one of the more unusual creatures to have evolved on this planet, and it has earned its viral fame. But the animal in the cartoon is a cartoon. The actual creature is stranger, and the direction it is stranger in is not the one most people expect. The viral image sells an animal that sees more, hits harder, outperforms you across the board. The real animal does some of that. It also does something else, something harder to put into a caption, and which a 40-year scientific literature has quietly been trying to describe. We can start in the simplest place, with the punch. When a mantis shrimp strikes, its front appendage accelerates from rest to about 23 meters per second in roughly 0.002 of a second. That acceleration, around 10,000 times the force of gravity, is the part of the story that usually gets told. It is, by itself, a remarkable number. A Formula One driver experiences 5 to 6 G through a corner. An astronaut at launch, 3 to 4. This animal, several inches long, runs its own limb through 10,000. It does this dozens of times a day, every day, for its entire life. But the acceleration is only the setup. When a limb moves through water that quickly, water cannot get out of the way fast enough. Behind the limb, a low-pressure pocket opens for a few hundred microseconds. And in that pocket, water does not simply flow aside, it vaporizes. A bubble of water vapor forms in the wake of the strike, and as the pressure of the surrounding water pushes back in, the bubble collapses violently. On the scale of the animal, that collapse is its own small explosion, a second shock wave traveling inward, focused on the same point the limb was already aimed at. This is why, when the physics of the strike was finally worked out properly, with high-speed cameras and underwater force sensors, across a series of experiments in the early 2000s, it turned out that every strike is actually 2 blows, not one. The first from the limb, the second, a few hundred microseconds later, from the collapse of the bubble the limb left behind. If the limb misses, the bubble can still kill. The other detail, which sits in the published literature and rarely makes the viral posts, when that bubble collapses, the gas trapped inside is compressed so severely, so quickly, that for an interval measured in trillionths of a second, it reaches temperatures within the rough neighborhood of the sun's surface. It emits a small flash of light, sonoluminescence in the formal term. The flash is too faint and too brief for a human eye, and the animal has no use for it. It is simply something that falls out of the physics every time the animal strikes. Every hunt, in other words, is also, technically, a very small star, appearing and disappearing at the tip of a claw. So the animal in the cartoon, the punch-hard, see more colors, outperforms you animal, is a version of this creature that is true as far as it goes and sells itself short. The real mantis shrimp is a small body that has spent a long evolutionary history solving a problem in condensed matter physics, and solving it so thoroughly that human engineers are, as of this year, still learning things about how the solution actually works, which is where we start. Before we go any further, if what you're listening to tonight feels like it's worth the time someone spent making it, the subscribe button does more for a channel like this than almost anything else, and the comments are where I find out what people actually think. If there's a creature you've always heard about and never quite trusted, something you've seen in a video and suspected the story was more complicated, tell me in the comments. I read them, and those are the ones I remember. For now, it is just after sunrise, somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. A peacock mantis shrimp, about the length of a human hand, has come to the entrance of its burrow and is not moving. It has seen us, or it has not. It makes no difference. It is about to do the thing it does, the thing that for a long time no one could quite explain. And if we slow the event down enough, there will be a brief, faint flash at the tip of its claw, and the water will never quite forgive it. The reef at Lembeh is not the postcard version of a reef. It sits in a strait on the north coast of Sulawesi, in Indonesia, and the bottom is black, volcanic sand, fine-grained, sloping gently away from shore into deeper water. The water itself is often cloudy with particulate, the coral sparse, the overall impression closer to ruin than to paradise. Divers come to Lembeh anyway, because the creatures that live on black sand are not the ones you see on the bright reefs further south. They are stranger, smaller, more specialized, and more willing to be watched. It is 9 in the morning, 15 meters down. The light that reaches this depth has already been filtered through the upper column of water, and most of the red wavelengths have been absorbed on the way. What arrives at the sand is a kind of blue-green twilight, shifting slightly with every surface swell. A hand-sized animal is at the entrance of a U-shaped burrow it dug into the substrate some weeks ago and has been defending in various small ways ever since. The animal is a peacock mantis shrimp, Odontodactylus cilarus, to give it its taxonomic label once and then leave it alone. Its carapace carries the colours the species is famous for: a base of deep olive green, orange along the legs, leopard-like spots across the upper shell, 2 purple eyes lifted on stalks that rotate independently of each other and of the body. The colours are not an accident of lighting. The animal genuinely looks like this. At rest in blue-green Lembeh light, it appears almost fluorescent. 2 meters away, moving along the sand, there is a clam. The clam is the reason for the motionlessness. The mantis shrimp has been tracking it for some seconds now, one eye on the clam and one eye scanning the water column for anything larger than itself. The 2 eyes work as 2 independent cameras, feeding a single brain, and what the brain is doing with those 2 streams of information is part of a puzzle we will get to later. For now, the eyes have agreed. The clam is alone, the clam is close enough, and the clam has not yet noticed what is watching it. The animal's front appendages are folded under its head in a resting position that looks, from the side, somewhat like the praying forelimbs of the insect it was named after. Inside each of those folded limbs, a mechanism has already been arming itself for several seconds. Muscles contracting slowly, compressing a saddle-shaped piece of the exoskeleton into a loaded spring, latches holding the assembly at peak tension, the whole system waiting for the signal to release. The animal is, by any mechanical definition, a loaded crossbow that has walked itself into position. What happens next lasts about 2.5 thousandths of a second, and to describe it properly, we have to slow it down by a factor of several thousand. At time 0, the latches release. The stored energy in the saddle springs unloads through a short linkage of exoskeletal plates, and one of the front limbs swings forward. Within the first half millisecond, the club at the end of that limb is already moving at something like 10 meters per second. By 1.5 milliseconds, it has reached roughly 23 meters per second, about 50 miles per hour, underwater in a liquid 800 times denser than air. By 2 milliseconds, the club has covered the distance to the clam. The clam's shell, which has been holding the animal's body pressure against the outside water for the clam's entire adult life, now has to absorb that velocity in a single point contact, and it cannot. The shell fractures along a line through the hinge, and the clam is, as a functional organism, finished. At this point in the event, the mantis shrimp has not yet completed its swing. The acceleration required to move a limb that fast over that little distance from a standing start is around 10,400 times the force of gravity. This is where the familiar comparison comes from, the one you have probably heard, that the strike accelerates at roughly the rate of a .22 caliber bullet leaving the barrel of a gun. The comparison is roughly fair. What the comparison does not capture is that the bullet is propelled by an exploding chemical charge inside a rigid steel chamber, and this animal is propelling a limb made of chitin and calcified protein powered by biological muscle in open water. And this is the part of the physics that is easy to miss on a first pass, because water is so much denser than air, and because the limb is accelerating through it that quickly, the water directly behind the limb simply cannot flow in fast enough to fill the space the limb is leaving. The pressure drops. It drops far enough and quickly enough that the water molecules in that pocket can no longer hold together as a liquid. They vaporize. In the wake of a single strike, a short-lived bubble of water vapor opens up between the limb and the prey. Not because the animal is trying to produce it, but because the laws of fluid dynamics require it. The bubble exists for a few hundred microseconds, then the surrounding water at full ocean pressure collapses it, and when that bubble collapses, everything interesting happens at once. The gas inside compresses to a point far smaller than the original bubble, the temperature inside that point spikes, and a second shock wave, nearly as energetic as the first impact, radiates out from the collapse site into the shell, into the sand, into the clam. This second blow arrives somewhere between 390 and 480 microseconds after the first. Both have been measured directly with underwater piezoelectric force sensors in Sheila Patek and Roy Caldwell's laboratory at Berkeley. The first peak regularly exceeds 1,000 newtons of force. The second, from the bubble collapse alone, can exceed 500. A small animal with a small limb delivering in less than a millisecond more than 100 kilograms of peak force through a single contact point, and then doing it again almost immediately from a source that isn't physically there. All of this is what the clam experiences, not a punch, an event. The word punch, when we use it for this animal, turns out to be a translation error. It is the closest word we have, because most human experience of forceful contact between two bodies involves a fist and a face, and we don't have better vocabulary for what is happening here. But the mechanics are not the mechanics of a fist. A human punch is a muscle throwing a mass at a target. A mantis shrimp strike is a spring unloading so fast that the surrounding medium participates, and the target gets hit by the medium as well as by the limb. The animal is not, at the millisecond scale, hitting the clam. The animal is starting a small, contained physics experiment adjacent to the clam. The clam is standing inside the experiment. It is worth pausing on the scale of this for a moment. The strike is complete before a human eye has begun to register that anything has moved. A relaxed human blink takes somewhere between 100 and 400 milliseconds to complete, 50 to 200 times as long as a single mantis shrimp strike. By the time your eyelid has traveled halfway down, this animal has fractured a shell, generated a vapor bubble, collapsed that bubble back into liquid water, delivered a secondary shock front through the shell and the sand, and begun retrieving its limb to the folded position. It does all of this with a body assembled entirely from the same materials, protein, chitin, calcium, that we find in different arrangements, in crab legs and lobster claws, and the shells of every other crustacean on the reef. There is nothing exotic in the inventory, only in the arrangement. which is the question that hovers over the rest of the evening. Everything on this black sand bottom, the clam, the burrow, the shrimp, the decaying coral, the pieces of shell from earlier strikes that the animal has tossed out of its burrow and which lie scattered within a few centimeters of the entrance, is built from roughly the same chemistry. The difference between the hunter and the hunted is not what they are made of. It is how the same small set of materials has been assembled and reassembled across a few 100 million years of slow evolutionary editing into two very different kinds of body. The clam's strategy was a shell. The shrimp's strategy was a spring. In the water at Lembe, the strike is over. The peacock mantis shrimp has already carried the clam back into its burrow, where it will break through the remaining shell at its own pace, and where the reef will forget, within minutes, that the event ever took place. The particulate in the water settles. The other small creatures on the sand resume their own small errands. A faint pop, the collapse of the cavitation bubble, recorded on underwater microphones as something much louder than it feels to the animals nearby, has already dissipated into the general background acoustic noise of a working reef and will be indistinguishable within seconds from the clicks and rasps of shrimp and fish elsewhere along the strait. The spring itself, though, is a separate story. The saddle under the animal's exoskeleton, the network of latches that held the tension and released it at exactly the right instant, the 4-bar linkage that converted stored elastic energy into a blur of motion at the end of a limb. None of that is obvious from watching the animal. All of it had to be inferred, slowly and carefully, by people who spent years holding cameras and force sensors over captive specimens and running the numbers afterward. What they found when they finally worked it out was that the physics we have just walked through is not the interesting part. The interesting part is how the animal stores the energy in the first place. Here is a question that sounds almost too simple to take seriously. How does a small animal, powered by biological muscle, move one of its own limbs at 50 miles an hour through water? The honest answer, the one researchers arrived at after decades of careful measurement, is that it does not directly. Muscle by itself cannot do this. The chemistry of muscle contraction, actin sliding against myosin, driven by ATP, has hard physical limits on how quickly it can deliver energy to a mechanical system, and those limits fall well below what this animal is doing. If you handed a team of engineers a budget of biological muscle tissue and asked them to build something that could swing a small club at 23 meters per second underwater, they would tell you it was not possible. They would be right for the direct approach. The mantis shrimp does not use the direct approach. What it uses, instead, is one of the oldest tricks in mechanical engineering. Older than mechanical engineering itself, since some version of it appears in the bodies of animals that were loading and releasing biological springs hundreds of millions of years before humans built the first crossbow. The principle is simple enough to describe in a single sentence. A slow muscle gradually loads energy into an elastic structure. A latch holds that energy in place, and when the latch releases, all of the stored energy comes out at once, far faster than the muscle alone could deliver it. The muscle sets the timer. The spring does the work. In the strictly technical literature, this arrangement has a name: latch-mediated spring actuation, shortened to LAMSA in the papers, and once you know to look for it, you start seeing it everywhere in biology. The jaws of trapjaw ants close on prey at speeds that would liquefy the ant's own facial muscles if they had to produce that motion directly. A latch and a spring are doing the work, and the muscles have only to arm the system. The Venus flytrap snaps shut through a similar principle, though its spring is hydraulic rather than elastic, Fleas jump through latch-mediated release, froghoppers, grasshopper mandibles, certain fungal spore ejections, the tongue of the chameleon, all of these are variations on the same theme. Something slow stores energy, something fast releases it. The muscle does not have to be quick, it only has to be patient. What distinguishes the mantis shrimp in this company is the scale of the system and the precision with which it has been put together. Trapjaw ants are small, fleas are smaller. A peacock mantis shrimp is not enormous, but at 15 centimeters and roughly the mass of a dry tea bag, it is many times larger than most of the other animals whose mechanics have been worked out in this kind of detail. Size matters because the engineering problem changes with scale. At a very small size, a spring can be almost arbitrarily stiff without damaging the body around it. At the mantis shrimp's size and at the forces involved, the spring has to be tuned. Too stiff, and the animal's own exoskeleton fractures when the latch releases. Too compliant, and the energy leaks out of the system before it reaches the limb. The tuning problem is non-trivial, and the solution the mantis shrimp has arrived at is worth walking through carefully. The spring is not a single piece. It is a composite of two elastic elements built into the animal's upper arm, the merus segment in the anatomical vocabulary, and arranged so that each element loads and releases in a coordinated way. The first element is a saddle-shaped piece of the exoskeleton on the upper surface of the merus, a structure that, when the animal is at rest, sits in a relaxed neutral curve. As the loading muscles contract, the saddle is forced downward at its center and outward at its edges, bending into a shape that a materials scientist would recognize as a paraboloid under compression. Paraboloids under compression store enormous amounts of elastic energy per unit mass and release it, when released, in a single clean burst. Sheila Patek's laboratory, first at Berkeley, now at Duke, was the group that first identified the saddle as the primary energy storage structure in a short paper in Nature in 2004 that is still, 21 years later, the foundational reference for how this mechanism works. The second element is a stiffened extension of the exoskeleton on the underside of the same segment, a structure the researchers call the moral V. Where the saddle bends, the moral V compresses, and the two elements store energy in parallel, bending above, compressing below, so that the total amount of energy banked in the animal's arm for a given amount of muscle work is substantially more than either structure alone could hold. The geometry of this composite spring is elegant enough that human engineers, working on impact-resistant composites for aerospace and military applications, have spent the last decade trying to copy it. Their results are promising. They are not yet as good as the original. The latch that holds the spring in its loaded state is, in mechanical terms, almost disappointingly simple. A pair of small projections on the flexor side of the joint engages with a pair of corresponding catches on the merus, and when those projections are in place, the entire tensioned assembly is held against release. The slow-loading muscles, which have been contracting throughout the arming phase, do nothing to launch the limb directly. Their job is to load the spring and keep the latches engaged. The release, when it comes, is triggered by a different set of muscles, much smaller, whose contraction pulls the latches clear in a fraction of a millisecond. At that moment, the saddle snaps back toward its relaxed curve. The moral V extends from compression, and the energy stored in both elements dumps, all at once, into a short linkage of exoskeletal plates called a 4-bar linkage. The 4-bar linkage is the part of the system that converts that burst of energy into a specific motion, the rotational launch of the club at the end of the limb. 4-bar linkages are familiar from mechanical engineering. They appear in everything from car suspension systems to the pedaling geometry of a bicycle, and their behavior is well understood. In the Mantis shrimp, the 4-bar linkage takes the roughly linear release of the saddle and Merrill V and converts it into an angular acceleration of the dactyl segment, the club, against a fixed pivot. What comes out the other end is a strike. What went in was a slow, deliberate, patient loading. The transformation is clean, and the efficiency of it is something the engineering community finds genuinely impressive. The whole mechanism, from arming to release to full extension, has been modelled, measured, filmed at 100,000 frames per second, reverse-engineered in 3 dimensions, and tested against mathematical predictions in ways that most small animal biomechanics has never been. The basic picture has held up across every measurement. What was once a mystery, how a small animal moved its own limb that fast, has become a fairly well understood piece of engineering, and the understanding has been rich enough to inspire a small industry of bio-inspired materials research, much of it funded by the United States Air Force, all of it descended from the question that a postdoc named Sheila Patek was asking in the late 1990s when she first put a high-speed camera in front of a Berkeley captive specimen and waited to see what the animal did. One detail of the mechanism is worth lingering on because it explains something about the rhythm of the animal's behavior. Loading the spring takes time. Not a long time by human standards. A well-rested peacock mantis shrimp can arm and release in under a second, but long enough that the animal must, before every strike, commit to the loading phase well before the target is in range. This is why you see the animals sitting so still at the mouths of their burrows. The stillness is not patience in any emotional sense. It is, at least partly, a mechanical necessity. The spring has to be ready. Once it is ready, the strike is triggered by a much smaller and much faster decision, a release rather than a launch, and the decision window is essentially instantaneous. The animal is waiting, with a loaded crossbow, for the moment at which a single short muscular twitch will be enough to end the problem in front of it. It is almost the opposite of how a human being throws a punch. A human punch is a gradual thing. Feet, hips, shoulders, arm, fist, delivered in a kinetic chain that takes perhaps 100 milliseconds from commitment to contact. Most of the energy is generated during the strike itself by muscles contracting as the punch extends. The mantis shrimp does no work during the strike. All of the work has already been done, seconds earlier, quietly under the skin. By the time the club is moving, the event is already over in every way except the part the clam experiences. There is a practical consequence of this arrangement that deserves a mention because it tends to get lost under all the numbers. A loaded spring is a hazard to the thing holding it. If an animal has spent several seconds storing an enormous amount of elastic energy in its own upper arm and then something goes wrong, a latch fails prematurely, a muscle twitch releases the system before the animal meant it to, a predator strikes the merus while the spring is cocked, the animal has in effect built a small bomb into its own body, and the energy in that bomb will come out somewhere. The mantis shrimp has, as far as anyone has been able to tell, solved this problem. Premature releases are rare. The latch mechanism appears to be robust enough across the animal's lifetime that the system can be armed and released many thousands of times without the catastrophic failures you might expect from something built this close to its material limits. How exactly it does this, how the latch stays reliable, how the spring does not fatigue, how the 4-bar linkage does not crack from the cyclical loading, is itself a research problem, and one that has only partly been answered. Which brings us back sideways to the strike itself. We have, so far, been looking at the animal's side of the event, how it stores the energy, how it releases the energy, how it gets the limb from rest to 23 meters per second in less than 2.5 milliseconds. We have not yet looked at what happens on the water side of the event. A limb moving that fast through seawater is not simply punching through a soft medium. It is doing something to the water itself, and the water, for a few hundred microseconds, is not behaving the way water normally behaves. And that is where the story of this strike starts to get genuinely strange. Water, at the scales most of us inhabit, is a forgiving material. It parts around a swimming hand without complaint, closes behind a dropped stone, accepts the passage of fish and boats and submarines without anything we would describe as protest. The forgivingness is an illusion of scale, however. Push water hard enough, fast enough, in a small enough region, and it stops behaving like the substance we know. It starts behaving like something much closer to a solid, or at the speeds and pressures that interest the mantis shrimp, like something that has run out of ways to cope and begins to do things liquids are not supposed to do. The strike, as we described it, accelerates a club through seawater at something like 10,000 G. On the club side of the event, this is mechanically demanding but comprehensible. On the water side, it is a genuine crisis. Water is 800 times denser than air, and at the speeds involved in the strike, the water directly behind the club cannot flow in quickly enough to fill the space the club is leaving. The gap that opens for a few hundred microseconds is a region of pressure so low that the water molecules in it can no longer hold together as a liquid. They do the only thing left to them. They vaporize. This is cavitation, and it is one of the more unusual physical phenomena the natural world produces. It is responsible for the damage you see on old boat propellers, where the leading edges have been pitted and gnawed at by invisible microscopic explosions over years of use. It is the mechanism by which snapping shrimp, a separate group of crustaceans evolutionarily quite distant from the mantis shrimp, disable their prey by closing a specialized claw so quickly that the cavitation bubble itself does the killing. It appears in industrial mixing equipment, in certain medical ultrasound applications, in the hydrodynamics of fast-moving fishtails. Whenever a fluid is asked to do the impossible, cavitation is one of the ways the fluid declines. In the mantis shrimp's case, the cavitation bubble forms not ahead of the club, but alongside it in the narrow volume between the curved inner face of the club and the outer surface of whatever the club is about to strike. The geometry here matters, because the bubble forms in a confined region between two surfaces, and because the club is decelerating as it reaches the target. The bubble's life and death are quite tightly coupled to the strike. It opens for a few hundred microseconds, it collapses, and when it collapses, it does so with enough concentrated energy that the collapse is itself a shock wave, radiating out from the center of the vanishing bubble, into the shell of the prey, into the sand around it, and, not incidentally, back into the club that caused it. This is the second of the two force peaks that were measured in the Berkeley laboratory. The first peak is the club hitting the target. The second peak is the collapse of the bubble the club left behind. They arrive between 390 and 480 microseconds apart, and from the perspective of the clam, or the snail, or whichever small hard-shelled creature the animal has selected for the evening, they are essentially indistinguishable. The shell does not know which one cracked it. In many cases, both did. And in the laboratory cases where researchers positioned a force sensor a small distance away from where the club could actually land, where the strike missed, in other words, the cavitation collapse was still registered as a serious blow. The mantis shrimp does not have to connect to do damage. The water, once it has been disturbed that violently, does some of the damage on the animal's behalf. The physics of bubble collapse is worth pausing on because it takes the story into territory that feels, on a first encounter, slightly improbable. When a cavitation bubble collapses, the surrounding fluid does not simply fill the void. The collapse is symmetric, approximately, walls of water converging on a single point from all directions. And as the bubble shrinks, its contents are compressed. What is inside the bubble is mostly water vapor, with some dissolved gas, and as the walls close in, that gas has nowhere to go. It compresses. As it compresses, the first law of thermodynamics does what it does, and the temperature inside the collapsing bubble rises, not gradually, but severely, over an interval measured in nanoseconds. Laboratory measurements of tightly controlled sonoluminescence, which is the phenomenon cavitation collapses produce, have recorded internal temperatures of many thousands of Kelvin. In extreme laboratory setups with specially tuned acoustic drivers, the temperatures inside a single collapsing bubble have been estimated at over 20,000 Kelvin, hotter by the rough measure than the visible surface of the sun. The Mantis shrimp's bubbles are not laboratory bubbles. They are messier, less symmetric, faster living, and the temperatures they reach are almost certainly lower than the extreme laboratory values. The honest range for a Mantis shrimp cavitation event is something like a few thousand Kelvin at the instant of collapse, within roughly the same order of magnitude as the sun's photosphere, but not above it. The popular framing, "The animal's punch is hotter than the sun," slightly oversells the science, and once you see what is actually being compared, the true story is more interesting than the headline. This animal is not producing nuclear core temperatures. It is producing, for a fraction of a microsecond, a point source of heat comparable, roughly, to the surface of a star, repeatedly. As a normal part of its diet, the temperature, high as it is, would be unremarkable if it simply dissipated back into the surrounding water as sound and heat. The more curious thing is that it does not quite. Some small fraction of the energy is released as light. This is sonoluminescence. The word is a compound of sonus, sound, and luminescence, the emission of light, a label that was coined in the 1930s when physicists first noticed that water driven hard by high-frequency sound could produce faint flashes of visible light from nowhere identifiable. The mechanism is still, even now, not perfectly understood. The leading account is that the compressed gas inside the collapsing bubble briefly reaches a plasma state, a fourth state of matter, in which electrons have been stripped from their atoms, and the flash is the radiation emitted as those electrons recombine. The flash lasts at most a few hundred picoseconds. That is trillionths of a second. It is below the threshold of the human eye, which needs something like a 10,000th of a second of exposure to register light at all. If you were holding the Mantis shrimp in front of you in a dark room and it struck, you would not see the flash. No animal, as far as anyone has been able to determine, sees the flash. Cameras have to be slowed into the picosecond range before the flash is even recordable, and most cameras cannot do that. The light is there. The light is, in every measurable sense, real. No eye has ever been built by evolution that could actually perceive it. This is one of the quieter strangenesses of the animal, and it is worth stating plainly. Every time this creature strikes prey, it produces, in the water in front of it, a miniature and unseen star, a concentrated region of plasma, lasting less time than it takes a neuron to fire, emitting a faint broadband flash that nothing alive has ever directly witnessed. The phenomenon is a byproduct. It serves no purpose for the animal. The Mantis shrimp does not need the light and cannot use the light. It is simply what falls out of the physics every time a spring-loaded club is released into seawater at 23 meters per second. Across the hundreds of millions of years that cavitation-producing strikes have existed on this planet, the total number of small stars briefly produced by small crustaceans in warm, shallow water is a number I would not venture to estimate. It is, at any rate, very large. The earliest evidence that any animal was producing this effect came not from mantis shrimp but from pistol shrimp in the year 2000, when a group of acoustic physicists studying claw-snapping behavior noticed, almost as an aside, that the cavitation bubbles from pistol shrimp strikes emitted faint light. They published the finding under the informal name shrimpoluminescence, a joke that stuck because the scientific community has a soft spot for a good joke, and it took several more years and additional work in the Patek and Caldwell laboratories before the same effect was convincingly demonstrated in mantis shrimp. Both animals, it turns out, produce sonoluminescent cavitation as a routine consequence of their strikes. Neither uses the light. Neither has ever used the light. The light is not, in any biological sense, a signal or a tool. It is a receipt from the physics issued and immediately lost many thousands of times a day across the world's reefs. A few corollaries follow from all of this, which are worth mentioning before we move on. 1. The acoustic signal from a cavitation collapse is substantial. The collapse produces a pressure pulse that, to underwater microphones, registers as a sharp broadband pop, and on a healthy reef with many mantis shrimp and many pistol shrimp active at once, these pops accumulate into a background noise floor that is, to human instruments, surprisingly loud. Submarine sonar operators during the Second World War were occasionally thrown off by the noise levels coming from tropical snapping shrimp colonies, and the effect has been studied seriously as a source of ambient ocean acoustics ever since. The mantis shrimp adds to this chorus every time it feeds. 2. The cavitation shockwave is, at close range, not trivial. Force sensors placed a centimetre or two away from the strike site have recorded peak forces from the collapse alone exceeding 500 newtons. For a small animal, at close range, this is enough to stun or kill. The double blow structure of the strike is not ornamental. It is a genuine 1-2 punch, and it is the reason the mantis shrimp can afford, on occasion, to miss. The water completes the hunt. 3. The club, because it is the thing producing the cavitation bubble, is also the thing experiencing the collapse most intimately. The bubble forms a few millimeters from the club's striking surface. The shockwave that radiates out from the collapse is directed, in significant part, back at the club. A small animal that has just delivered 1,000 newtons of impact force through its own limb is now, a few hundred microseconds later, receiving a 500 Newton shockwave from the water the limb displaced. Whatever this animal is mechanically, it is not just a thing that hits hard. It is a thing that hits hard and then absorbs the rebound of its own hitting without somehow destroying itself in the process. That last point, how the animal survives its own weapon, sounds like it should be obvious. It is not. It is one of the deepest open questions in the biomechanics of this species, and for a long time it had no satisfying answer at all. The club, in a purely structural sense, should not survive the strike. It should fracture, fatigue, delaminate, or otherwise fail under the repeated loading of such extreme forces, much as a cheap tool fails under similar abuse. The animal's clubs do none of this. A healthy adult peacock mantis shrimp can strike day in and day out for the length of its working life, years in the wild, and its clubs remain, as far as anyone has measured, structurally sound. How the club manages this and what the answer to that question turned out to be is where this story takes its most surprising turn. And the answer, when it finally arrived, came not from the biomechanics laboratory where you might expect it, but from materials scientists and physicists working on a problem that, at first glance, had nothing to do with shrimp at all. In April of 1998, at an aquarium in the east of England, a mantis shrimp broke out of his enclosure. The details, as they were reported at the time and have been repeated with small variations in the science press ever since, are these. The animal was roughly 4 inches long. The enclosure wall was 1/4 of an inch of aquarium glass, the standard specification for a small display tank. The staff had named the animal Tyson, after the heavyweight boxer, because even by Mantis shrimp standards he was aggressive, and because the name landed. One day in April, the exact date does not appear in any of the available accounts, the glass gave way. Tyson came through it. The staff recovered him without injury on either side, and shortly afterward he was moved to a more secure facility at the Sea Life Centre in Great Yarmouth on the Norfolk coast, where he lived out the rest of his time in a tank rated for the kind of animal he turned out to be. Tyson is the mantis shrimp most people have at some point heard of. The story has travelled. It appears in popular science articles, in nature documentaries, in the longer caption versions of viral video compilations, and, quite frequently, in the comment sections underneath any social media post about this species. A small, hand-sized animal broke an aquarium. The image is too good not to repeat, and it has been repeated accurately for more than 1/4 of a century. The story is also, without quite intending to, responsible for one of the more stubborn misconceptions about this animal. Because the mantis shrimp you have probably heard about is the one that breaks glass. The phrase "can break aquarium glass" has attached itself to the species the way certain phrases attach to certain animals. Dolphins are clever, elephants never forget, ravens hold grudges, and the phrase "on its face" is true. Tyson is evidence. Other cases, less famous but verifiable, exist. Certain species of smasher kept in insufficient tanks under sufficient provocation or boredom will eventually crack the glass. Aquarium hobbyist forums keep a running, if cautious, record of incidents. The engineering of modern public aquarium tanks genuinely accounts for the possibility. None of this is invented. What is invented, or at least badly overstated, is the impression that breaking glass is what these animals do, that a mantis shrimp will, given any opportunity, reduce its enclosure to shards, that every strike is a full commitment effort, a catastrophe waiting for a surface to land on. Almost none of this is accurate, and the reason it is not accurate goes to something genuinely interesting about how this animal uses its own weapon. A mantis shrimp strike, as we have been describing it, is an extreme event. It takes energy, it takes time to arm, it produces a shock wave that the animal itself has to absorb through a club that, however remarkable, is still a finite biological structure. And the animal, as it turns out, knows this. Not in the sense of conscious calculation, we should be careful with that kind of language around any small crustacean, but in the sense that its behavior, measured carefully over many encounters, shows clear evidence of strike control. A mantis shrimp does not strike at full tension every time. A mantis shrimp does not strike at every available target. The strikes the animal produces during a ritualized contest with another mantis shrimp are measurably different, in energy and in deployment, from the strikes it produces while hunting prey. The strikes it produces during a display, a warning rather than an attack, are different again. The full commitment, 1,000-Newton, cavitation-generating strike is one of several modes the animal has available, and the animal appears to select among them according to the situation in front of it. This was one of the more unexpected findings to come out of the biomechanical literature on this species. Before the careful video work, there was a reasonable assumption that a mantis shrimp, when it decided to strike, simply hit as hard as it could. The reasoning went something like, the mechanism is spring-loaded, the spring is either loaded or it isn't, and releasing a partly loaded spring seems mechanically awkward. You would expect a binary system. What researchers in the Patek and Green laboratories found instead, when they filmed strikes across predation and contest contexts, was that the same animal on different days would produce strikes that varied substantially in their kinematics. A strike against a rival mantis shrimp during a territorial dispute did not look the same as a strike against a snail. The animal was calibrating. How it was calibrating mechanically. What muscles were being held back? What portion of the spring was being armed? What fraction of the available energy was actually being released? Remains an active research question. That the calibration happens at all has been established. So the reason most mantis shrimp never break their tanks is not that they cannot. It is that, for most mantis shrimp, most of the time, there is no good reason to. A pane of aquarium glass is not a clam, it is not a rival. It is, in the animal's experience, roughly analogous to a wall, and walls do not generally prompt full-tension strikes from an animal that has other uses for its energy. Tyson broke through because Tyson, for whatever combination of temperament and circumstance, decided it was worth committing. Most mantis shrimp, in Tyson's position, would not. Which leads to a small reframing of what Tyson's story is actually telling us. The story, repeated as it usually is, lands on the idea that mantis shrimp are dangerous in a faintly comic, faintly thrilling way. Small, brightly coloured, and capable of breaking their container, as if the animal were always one mood away from a prison break. This is good copy, and it is how the story has survived in the popular imagination. But the more useful version of the same story is that mantis shrimp are dangerous in a way that is almost entirely, almost always kept in reserve. The glass-breaking capacity is real. It is rarely exercised. What is exercised constantly is a capacity for carefully graded violence against specific targets for specific reasons, at specific levels of commitment, in a kind of moment-to-moment inventory taking of how much force the current situation actually deserves. This is a very different animal from the one in the cartoon. The cartoon animal is a hair trigger. The real animal is an extremely disciplined practitioner of force, whose default setting against almost everything is to hold back. Roy Caldwell, the Berkeley biologist whose laboratory has been the hub of mantis shrimp behavioral research for the better part of half a century, has spent a great deal of his career trying to get this point across to people who have only encountered the viral version. In interviews, he tends to describe mantis shrimp as animals who know exactly what they are holding and who treat the holding of it as a responsibility. They do not strike at random. They do not strike at everything. When they strike, the strike has usually been earned by the circumstance, and the force delivered is usually proportioned to the circumstance. The exceptions, and Tyson is, in his way, one of them, tend to involve specific combinations of captivity, stress, inadequate shelter, and an individual animal with an unusual temperament. In the wild, full-tension strikes against inappropriate targets are apparently quite rare. In aquarium settings, they are a management problem that most serious facilities have, by now solved through tank design. Tyson himself, by all available accounts, settled down after the move to Great Yarmouth. His new tank was built for the kind of animal he was. He did not break it. The staff there have kept mantis shrimp of various species more or less continuously since. At the time of writing, the Sea Life Centre's current star among the mantis shrimp is a zebra mantis shrimp named Odin, a long banded spearer species several times Tyson's size, who has never shown any interest in the walls of his enclosure and probably never will, because zebra mantis shrimp are spearers, not smashers, and their front appendages have different uses. Odin's version of what this species can do involves harpooning small fish from the mouth of a burrow. It is its own kind of dramatic. It is not a glass-breaking kind. There is something worth sitting with in the difference between Tyson and Odin. Two animals, separated by a quarter of a century and by roughly the same distance in the stomatopod family tree that separates, say, a wolf from a coyote, one built to hammer, the other built to spear, both extremely good at the thing they are built to do, both kept now in the same small aquarium on the same English coast. If you visited Great Yarmouth today and stood in front of Odin's tank, you would be looking at the current generation of an animal whose near relative in the same building once defeated quarter-inch glass. Odin will not do what Tyson did. It is not in his equipment. If you walked down the coast to a different kind of tank in another part of the facility and a peacock mantis shrimp had been installed there, a full-grown adult of the species we opened this story with, on the black sand at Lember, you would be looking in principle at an animal with all of Tyson's equipment. Whether that animal ever chose to use it would depend on 1,000 small variables the animal itself was tracking, most of which you could not see. That is not nothing. An animal that can do extraordinary damage and chooses not to across most of its waking life is a different sort of creature from an animal that simply cannot. The second kind is safe because it is harmless. The first kind is safe because it is restrained. Tyson is often invoked as a cautionary tale about the first type being mistakenly treated as the second. It is a reasonable cautionary tale. What it less often gets credit for, in the retelling, is what it implies about the restraint itself. The restraint is worth pausing on because it points at something the mechanical descriptions in the last 2 chapters have not quite reached. An animal with a loaded spring in each of its arms, with a weapon system that can produce forces thousands of times its body weight, with the physics of its strike generating actual plasma in the water in front of it. This animal has, across the entirety of its evolutionary history, solved not only the problem of how to deliver the strike, but the problem of when and how hard and against whom. The mechanical solution is remarkable. The behavioral solution is, in some ways, more remarkable. And both of them together are a great deal older than most people, on first encounter, would guess. This is one of the surprises waiting in the mantis shrimp's deeper history. The animal that broke the aquarium in Norfolk in 1998 was the current end of a lineage that had been refining this particular combination, the weapon, and the judgment about when to use it, for a length of time that is hard to grasp in ordinary human units. How long exactly, and what the animal looked like before the weapon arrived, and what the fossil record has to say about any of this, is its own story. And the story, when you lay it next to Tyson, turns out to rearrange some of the assumptions about what kind of creature this is, and how old that kind of creature actually is. A small confession before we go any further. The name we have been using, mantis shrimp, is, strictly speaking, wrong in both directions. The animal is not a mantis. It is also not a shrimp. It belongs to neither group, and the groups it does not belong to are, in evolutionary terms, separated from it by truly enormous spans of time. The label is a convenience of English, borrowed from the superficial resemblance between the folded front limbs of these animals and the folded front legs of a praying mantis, which is an insect which is not closely related to them, and then bolted onto the general word for a small crustacean, which is also not what they are. The creature we have been describing sits in its own taxonomic order, the Stomatopoda, and has sat there on its own for a length of time that it is worth trying to feel the weight of. The stomatopods diverged from the other crustacean lineages something like 340 million years ago. That number written out does not do much. It is the kind of figure that slides off the mind if it is not grounded in something. So let us try to ground it. 340 million years ago is before the first dinosaur. It is before the first mammal. It is before any vertebrate had, in any meaningful sense, moved away from water as its primary environment. The early tetrapods were still working out the basic engineering of limbs and lungs at that point, and would not produce anything resembling a confident land animal for another 30 or 40 million years. The forests of that period were forests of giant club mosses and horsetails, some of them 40 meters tall, growing in swampy lowlands under a thicker atmosphere than we breathe today. Insects had recently figured out how to fly, and some of them, the enormous dragonfly-like Meganeura with a 70-centimeter wingspan, were the largest flying things that have ever lived. Giant millipede-like creatures called Arthropleura, 2.5 meters long, were crawling along the forest floors of what is now Europe and North America. The atmosphere had a higher oxygen concentration than today, which is part of why everything on land that breathed had, for a brief geological window, been permitted to be so large. Into that world, warm, swampy, oxygen-rich, still being colonized by the first serious land animals, the early stomatopods were already swimming in shallow seas. They did not look very much like a modern peacock mantis shrimp. They did not yet have the spring-loaded club. Some of them had long, slender front limbs, ending in barbed projections, which they used the way a modern Spira mantis shrimp uses its limbs, to impale soft-bodied prey from ambush. Others were generalist predators of a kind that modern stomatopods do not particularly resemble. What they shared with the modern animal, what makes the taxonomists comfortable calling them ancestral stomatopods at all, was a specific arrangement of the thoracic segments, a certain geometry of the raptorial appendages, and a general body plan that would be recognizable once you knew what you were looking for in any peacock mantis shrimp pulled out of a burrow in Lembe today. The fossil that cemented this picture has a name worth mentioning, because the name has a small joke in it that the person who named it clearly enjoyed. The species is Daedal acanthocercus. The first word is a reference to Daedalus, the legendary inventor from Greek myth, the man who built the labyrinth and the wings that failed his son. The second word is Latin for spiny-tailed. The fossil was described by Frederick Schramm in a 2007 paper that pulled together specimens from the American Midwest, and it dates to roughly 313 million years ago in what is now Illinois. Daedal is not quite the oldest stomatopod fossil, but it is one of the most completely preserved, and the anatomical details it provides are unambiguous. The lineage was already doing its own thing, already recognizably stomatopod, already separated by an unbridgeable distance of time from the other crustaceans in the same rocks. 313 million years. For context, the first true dinosaurs appeared around 230 million years ago. The lineage leading to mantis shrimp was already 80 million years old at that point, already established, already working on the evolutionary problems that stomatopods have been working on ever since. By the time Tyrannosaurus rex walked through what is now Montana, stomatopods had been swimming in shallow seas for 250 million years. All of this, it turns out, is only half of the story. Because the stomatopod lineage is ancient, but the specific weapon we have spent the last 3 chapters describing, the smasher club, the saddle spring, the cavitation-generating hammer, is, by the scale of this lineage, surprisingly young. The best estimate from a molecular phylogenetic study published in 2017 by Catherine van der Waal and colleagues is that the smashing appendage appeared somewhere around 126 million years ago. The study used a relaxed molecular clock calibrated against several stomatopod fossils, including Daedal, and the number has a reasonable confidence interval around it. The smasher might have appeared as long ago as 174 million years, or as recently as 87 million years, depending on which molecular model you trust more. But the central estimate, 126 million years, puts the smashing club squarely in the Cretaceous period. which is to say, when the first smasher mantis shrimp was testing its first cavitation bubble against the first shell it could not crack by simpler means, the dinosaurs were still in business. They would remain in business for another 60 million years before the Chicxulub asteroid ended most of them. This is a slightly disorienting piece of information once you let it settle. The Smasher Club, the specific piece of biological engineering that has carried this story, is younger than Tyrannosaurus rex. Not by a little, by something like 40 million years. While the great predatory dinosaurs were doing their work on land, a separate evolutionary experiment was running in the tropical shallows, in which a crustacean lineage that had already been around for 200 million years was developing a new kind of front limb, a shorter, thicker, more heavily mineralized version of the spearing appendage its ancestors had, and learning to use it not to impale but to hammer. The first smashers would not have been especially good at it. The mechanism, once it arrives in the fossil record, continues to refine itself across the following 100 million years, through the end of the Cretaceous, through the impact, through the long recovery, and on into the present. The spearing form of the limb, the older form, the one Didal used, the one our friend Odin at Great Yarmouth still uses today, is substantially more ancient. Spearers were the original stomatopod design, and for most of this lineage's history, spearers were the only design. For more than 200 million years, every mantis shrimp that ever existed was some version of a spear-hunting ambush predator. Then, in the middle of the Cretaceous, the smasher variant arose. It did not replace the spearers, it simply joined them, and the two forms have now been coexisting, diversifying alongside each other for the entire span from the age of dinosaurs to the age of underwater microphones in Berkeley laboratories. This is a pattern that shows up in a lot of animal lineages once you start looking for it. The old form persists. The new form arrives, not by replacing the old, but by specializing into a niche the old form never quite filled. Spearers do well in soft substrates, in sand and mud, where a long reach and a piercing strike are what you want for catching fish from ambush. Smashers do well on reefs and hard bottoms, where the available prey is armored. Snails, clams, crabs, and a crushing strike is what gets you through the armor. Neither form is better than the other. They are answers to different questions. It is worth pausing here on the spearer side of the family, because in this telling we have been leaning heavily on the smashers, and the spearers deserve their due. A giant zebra mantis shrimp like Odin, or the wild versions of his species, Lysiosquilina maculata, which grow to nearly 40 centimeters and live in long burrows dug into coral rubble, is a very different kind of animal from a peacock. A spearer does not hammer. Its front limbs end in long, fine, barbed projections, and it uses them in one clean ambush strike from the mouth of a concealed burrow. A small fish drifts past. The burrow opens. The spearer is on the fish in milliseconds, not by the same mechanism as a smasher. The kinematics are different. The force is smaller. The cavitation essentially absent. But by a strike that is, in its own way, equally impressive. The prey does not have time to register what has happened. The spearer retracts into its burrow with the fish impaled. The reef returns to its previous business. No glass breaks. There is a temptation when describing ancient lineages to treat the modern forms as the end of a story, the finished product, the point of the whole long evolutionary sequence. Stomatopods do not cooperate with this framing. What is alive today is not a culmination, it is a snapshot. The peacock mantis shrimp that broke the clam at Lembe is one moment in a 340 million year experiment that is still running, under pressures that are still shifting, producing variation that is still being selected on. The fact that the animal sitting in front of a diver's mask today looks so specific, so finished, so obviously itself, with its colours and its eyes and its weapon and its particular way of holding still at the mouth of its burrow, is an illusion of the temporal window we happen to be observing it through. If you could come back in another 100 million years, assuming the oceans were still warm enough and shallow enough and populated enough for stomatopods to persist, you would find animals that were recognizable as stomatopods, and you would find them doing things that the current forms do not do. The lineage is not finished. Nothing alive is. What is astonishing about the mantis shrimp, then, is not that such an animal exists. It is that this particular configuration of solutions, the ancient body, the Cretaceous-era weapon, the set of sensory and behavioral systems we are only beginning to understand, is the state of the art as of right now in this brief geological window for an ongoing evolutionary project that has been running continuously since before the first vertebrate walked. And the next part of the state of the art, the part that explains how this animal has been carrying a spring-loaded bomb inside its own arm for 126 million years without, on any systematic scale, destroying itself, is the part of the story that researchers have only recently, in the past year, actually managed to work out. The question had been sitting in the literature for almost 20 years. A small animal delivers 1,000 newtons of impact force through a short limb. A few hundred microseconds later, the cavitation collapse sends a second shock wave back through the same limb in the opposite direction. The animal does this hundreds of times a day, for years on end, over a working life that can extend in the wild well into its second decade, and the club, the piece of mineralized chitin at the end of the limb that absorbs all of this, does not fail. It does not crack, it does not fatigue, it does not, across any timescale anyone has been able to measure, break. By every rule of how materials are supposed to behave, this should not be possible. An engineer, handed those loading conditions and asked to design a component that would survive them, would come back with a component that lasted a few hundred strikes before showing damage and a few thousand before catastrophic failure. The mantis shrimp's club is routinely tested in the Patek laboratory through cycles that would obliterate almost anything human manufactured at the same scale, and the clubs come through essentially unchanged. They do something. No one could say with confidence what. For a long time, the working hypothesis focused on the club's internal architecture, and the architecture, it must be said, is impressive on its own. Materials scientists at the University of California, Riverside, working under David Kisailas, began publishing the detailed structure of the peacock mantis shrimp's club in the early 2010s, and what they found was an unusually intricate piece of biological engineering. The outer surface of the club, the part that actually meets the shell, is a hardened layer of mineralized chitin, reinforced with hydroxyapatite and fluorapatite, arranged in a dense, crack-resistant pattern. Below that outer layer, the bulk of the club is a composite material whose internal fiber orientation rotates gradually as you descend through it, in what materials scientists call a bulligand structure. A helicoidal stack of fiber layers, each one slightly rotated from the one above. The bulligand architecture shows up in several biological materials, most famously in the cuticle of certain beetles and lobsters, and it has a specific property that makes it useful for impact resistance. When a crack tries to propagate through a bulligand structure, it cannot run in a straight line. The rotating fiber orientation forces the crack to spiral, which consumes energy, which stops the crack before it reaches anything critical. Cracks in a bulligand material die young. Then, in 2016, the Kisailas group published a follow-up finding in the journal Advanced Materials that identified a second structural feature lying underneath the outer impact region, a herringbone or sinusoidal reinforcement. not previously seen in any biological material, which further redistributed stress away from the impact site and into the surrounding club. Three-dimensional printing of synthetic composites incorporating this herringbone pattern in subsequent work by Pablo Zavatieri's group at Purdue showed measurably improved impact resistance over straight helicoidal designs. The Air Force Office of Scientific Research took notice. A $7.5 million funding initiative was set up to explore Mantis shrimp-inspired composites for aerospace, automotive and body armor applications. Prototype helmets were produced. The military interest has only grown. All of this was real. The herringbone layer is real. The boulognon structure is real. The crack deflection properties of the composite are real. And yet, when the community stepped back and asked whether these features together were actually enough to account for what the club survives, the answer kept coming back, approximately, but not quite. The club should still be failing more often than it does. The materials story explained part of the puzzle. Some other mechanism had to be doing the rest. The full answer arrived in February of 2025 in a paper published in Science, and the answer was not what most people in the field had been expecting. The study was led by Horacio Espinosa's group at Northwestern University in collaboration with colleagues at Purdue and a postdoctoral researcher named Nicholas Alderete. The technique they used was laser ultrasonics, a method for probing the internal acoustic properties of a material by firing a short laser pulse at it and measuring how the resulting vibrations propagate through the structure. The technique had been used before on engineered materials to identify things like resonance frequencies and damping behavior. It had not been used in quite this way on a biological sample. What the Northwestern team wanted to know was whether the Mantis Shrimps Club, in addition to being mechanically tough, might also be doing something acoustically clever with the shock waves passing through it. What they found was that the club is not simply a hardened structure that absorbs impact, it is a frequency filter. The language is worth unpacking because it sits at the edge of ordinary physics vocabulary. A frequency filter, in the engineering sense, is a material or a structure that allows certain vibration frequencies to pass through while blocking others. The most familiar example is acoustic. A room treated with the right kind of panels will let low tones through and damp high ones, which is why recording studios look the way they do. The underlying principle is called a band gap, and it arises whenever a material has a periodic internal structure, whose spacing matches, in a specific mathematical way, the wavelengths of the vibrations you want to stop. The periodicity creates interference. The interference cancels certain frequencies and lets others pass. Engineers design materials with these properties on purpose for applications in vibration damping, acoustic insulation, and, increasingly, blast protection. The Northwestern team's finding was that the periodic layered structure inside the Mantis Shrimps Club, the same boligand helicoidal structure that Kisailis had been describing for years, functions as a band gap filter, but not a simple one. The internal spacing of the fiber layers is not uniform. It varies gradually from one side of the club to the other, which makes the structure a graded filter, a filter whose blocking frequencies shift as you move through the material, and the frequencies it blocks are not random. They correspond with suspicious precision to the frequencies generated by cavitation bubble collapse, which is to say, the shock wave from the cavitation collapse, the one that Patek and Caldwell measured with force sensors back in 2005, carries its energy in a specific frequency range. That range contains the frequencies most dangerous to soft biological tissue, the high-frequency shear waves that would otherwise propagate from the club through the limb and into the body of the animal, causing cellular damage at every step. The club, as it absorbs the shock wave, does not simply dissipate the energy, it filters it. The frequencies that matter, the damaging ones, are reflected or cancelled or dispersed within the club's own structure. The frequencies that do not matter are allowed to pass. The net effect is that the energy that leaves the back of the club heading into the rest of the limb is a significantly different spectral signature from the energy that entered the front. This is the part that is worth slowing down for. The club is a weapon, and we have been describing it as a weapon, and it is a weapon. But it is also, and at the same time, and in exactly the same piece of tissue, a piece of acoustic armor. The animal has not solved the problem of surviving its own strike by building a second structure to protect itself from the first. It has solved the problem by making the weapon itself the protection. The one organ that delivers the force is the one organ that prevents the force from returning. The same Bouligand layers that deflect cracks in the outer shell also interfere with the shockwave frequencies in the inner bulk, and the same club that turns a small animal into a creature capable of cracking crab carapaces also turns that animal into something that can do it thousands of times over without wrecking itself. There is a thing worth saying about this plainly, because it is one of the points in this story where the usual language feels thin. A human engineer, faced with the problem of designing a weapon that will survive its own use, will typically reach for two separate solutions: a hardened striking surface, and then, somewhere else in the system, a damping mechanism, a recoil absorber, a vibration isolator, a second structural element whose job is to keep the first structural element from destroying everything around it. The two solutions will be two components. They will be manufactured separately, mounted separately, and maintained separately. This is how almost every tool humans have ever built that repeatedly delivers high-impact forces has been designed. A jackhammer has a striking head and a vibration-isolated handle, and the two parts are mechanically distinct. A firearm has a barrel and a recoil spring, and they are separate pieces. The Mantis shrimp's club does not have separate pieces. The striking surface and the vibration filter are the same surface achieved by the same internal geometry, in one continuous piece of mineralized tissue grown from the same cells across the animal's developmental history. What looks from the outside like a small hammer is in fact a small hammer that has been infused at the molecular level with its own damping system, tuned to the specific frequencies the hammer produces in the specific medium the hammer operates in, during the specific kind of strike the animal actually uses. The engineering is not only elegant, it is of a kind that no human has, as of the writing of the Northwestern paper, been able to reproduce. The phononic filtering properties of the club have been measured. The attempts to replicate them in synthetic composites are ongoing. The current best human-engineered phononic metamaterials produced in laboratories for military and aerospace applications are several generations behind what this animal grows, as a matter of course, in the ordinary business of developing from a larva into an adult. It is worth pausing on the age of this because the age is part of what makes it strange. The club has been doing this for 126 million years. The specific combination of a striking surface that is simultaneously a phononic filter, tuned to the cavitation frequencies generated by a spring-loaded strike in seawater, was already working in the first Cretaceous smashes. It has continued working in variants of increasing refinement across every stomatopod generation since. The physics that describes why it works, the Bloch wave analysis, the band gap calculations, the mathematical framework for why certain periodic structures filter certain frequencies, was not developed by physicists until the 20th century. Human engineers could not have described what the club was doing, because the vocabulary did not exist. The animal did not need the vocabulary. The animal simply had to survive its own strike repeatedly for 126 million years, and the selection pressure did the rest. This is, at some level, what makes the creature we are describing genuinely difficult to think about clearly. Most of the impressive things it does, the speed, the force, the cavitation, the light, arise from a weapon. The weapon, on closer examination, is also the armor. The armor, on closer examination, is also a piece of physics we are only now able to describe mathematically, and still not able to manufacture. An enormous amount of biological engineering has been folded, across deep time, into a single 2-centimeter piece of tissue at the end of a limb on a hand-sized animal that lives in a burrow on a black sand slope in a strait in Indonesia. The animal does not know it is doing this. The animal does not need to know. The selection has done the knowing on the animal's behalf across a span of time much longer than any species of humans has existed, and the result is the thing you would be looking at if you were diving at Lemba this morning, watching a peacock emerge from its burrow and scan for prey. It would look from the outside like an animal with a colourful shell and 2 independent eyes and a pair of folded front limbs. It would look like a viral moment waiting to happen. The small animal, the quick strike, the satisfying crack of a clamshell giving way. And underneath all of that, every time it struck, a graded band gap filter tuned to its own cavitation frequencies would be doing quiet acoustic work inside its own weapon, cancelling the dangerous vibrations before they reach the animal's body, in a piece of structural engineering that the human species has been able to measure for less than a year. The weapon is old. The understanding is new. The animal has been carrying both of them in the same piece of tissue since long before anyone was around to ask about it. If you could watch the peacock come fully out of its burrow in the morning light at Lembe, the thing you would almost certainly notice first, after the colours, is the eyes. They sit on short stalks at the front of the head, one on each side, lifted slightly above the rest of the carapace. They are a pale purple, sometimes faintly blue depending on how the light catches them, and they move. Not in the way you might expect. A fish's eyes swivel in a coordinated pair, tracking a single point in space. A mammal's eyes, when they move at all, tend to move together. You can pick out the fixation target just by watching which way both eyes have gone. The peacock's eyes do not do this. Each one moves on its own, independently of the other, in long, slow rotations around the axis of its stalk, and in short, rapid saccades that sweep across the visual field the way a flashlight sweeps across a wall. You can watch one eye tracking the clam, while the other eye is already looking somewhere else entirely, up into the water column for predators, off to the side for rivals, back toward the burrow to check that the entrance is still clear. The 2 eyes share a brain. They do not share attention. This is, in itself, slightly disorienting to watch if you are used to the way most visual systems work. The sense it gives you when you first see it on video is that there are 2 separate animals living inside the same body, 2 independent lookouts, each running its own patrol, reporting back to a central command that is somehow stitching the 2 reports together into a single coherent picture of the reef. This is, roughly, what is happening. The degree to which the 2 feeds are actually integrated into a single experience, on the animal's side, is one of the more interesting open questions in stomatopod sensory neuroscience. But the first fact, the observable fact, is easy enough to describe. 2 eyes, independent motion, each one capable of its own work. The stranger part of the eye is the part you cannot see from the outside. When researchers first started to look, in the 1980s, at the internal structure of a stomatopod eye, they found something that did not fit any of the standard categories. The compound eyes of insects and most crustaceans are made up of thousands of small unit facets called ommatidia, each of which collects light from a narrow angle and feeds its signal back to the animal's visual processing. This is the standard crustacean plan. A stomatopod eye begins in more or less this way, with a dense array of ommatidia, but then, about a third of the way down from the top of the eye, the structure changes. A horizontal band cuts across the middle of the eye, a strip, 6 rows thick, of ommatidia that are clearly doing something different from the ommatidia above and below them. The rows of the midband, as this structure came to be called, are larger than the other ommatidia, more heavily pigmented and arranged in a geometry that suggests they are not sampling the general visual field at all. They are sampling something specific along a narrow horizontal line. Above and below the midband, the rest of the eye does ordinary-looking visual work, spatial vision, motion detection, the general business of seeing the world as a scene. The midband, in contrast, does the work that has made the stomatopod eye famous. The 6 rows contain 12 distinct types of photoreceptor, each tuned to a different wavelength of light, ranging from deep ultraviolet at 300 nanometers up to far red at 720. 4 of the 6 rows, rows 1 through 4, handle color. The remaining 2 rows, rows 5 and 6, handle polarization, including a kind of polarization that no other animal has ever been shown to detect. We will get to the polarization. The colors are enough to be going on with. A human retina, by way of comparison, has 3 types of color-sensitive cone photoreceptor, 3, across the entire visible spectrum, from about 400 nanometers to about 700. The stomatopod has 12 across a wider range, including wavelengths that extend well below the human threshold into the deep ultraviolet. On the simple count of photoreceptors alone, the stomatopod eye is 4 times more spectrally rich than ours and covers a wider spectrum. This is the fact that has travelled the furthest in the popular literature. The 16 colour receptor number you may have encountered, which is a slight overcount that includes certain ultraviolet subtypes and which gets used usually as the setup for a claim about the animal seeing colours human beings cannot even imagine. We will come back to that claim because it is a more complicated claim than it appears. But the structural facts are not in dispute. The animal has 12 narrow-band photoreceptors arranged in a strip across the middle of each of its 2 independently moving eyes, each one tuned to a different and precisely defined wavelength. The rest of its visual system, above and below that strip, does conventional spatial vision. Whatever the midband is for, it is a dedicated piece of optical equipment built into every adult mantis shrimp, clearly expensive to produce and clearly under strong selection, because the same arrangement has been preserved across stomatopod species for a very long time. There is another feature of the eye that deserves a mention, because it is, in its own quiet way, as unusual as the midband. In a typical compound eye, each individual ommatidium has a single small pupil, a dark central spot you can see if you look closely, which is the patch of facets currently aimed at you. A stomatopod eye has 3 separate pupil-like spots on each single eye visible simultaneously. The 3 pupils correspond to 3 regions of the eye that are all aimed at the same point in space from slightly different angles within the single eye, which means that each eye, on its own, is capable of judging depth. Not through parallax between 2 eyes, the way you and I judge depth, by having 2 separate eyes in 2 separate positions and letting the brain compute the offset, but through parallax within a single eye between its own 3 pupils. A stomatopod can gauge the distance to a target with one eye closed. It can gauge the distance to 2 different targets simultaneously, one with each eye, because each eye is an independent depth measuring system. This is not a minor feature. For an animal whose entire predatory strategy depends on delivering a strike at precisely the right distance, not a centimetre too close, not a centimetre too far, because the strike is committed before it is released, being able to judge range is essential. Most predators that rely on striking from a fixed position have evolved some solution to this problem. Chameleons have excellent parallax through two independently moving eyes. Jumping spiders have a remarkable multi-eye system with coupled focal depths. The stomatopod has taken a third path, which is to compress the entire parallax-based depth measuring system into a single eye, and then give the animal two of those eyes, each one working independently. An eye that gets damaged in a fight still leaves the other eye a fully functional depth measuring instrument. An animal that lost a whole eye would still be hunting with precision, which is not a claim many other predators can make. This is one of the places where the engineering language starts to feel thin and is worth acknowledging. Most descriptions of animal senses borrow the vocabulary of human optics, depth perception, color vision, polarization, because those are the words we have. The words are approximately right for this animal, but only approximately. The peacock mantis shrimp is not using its eyes the way a vertebrate uses eyes. It is not constructing a single unified scene and then selecting objects out of it. It is, as far as anyone can tell from the neuroanatomy, doing something more like running two independent, simultaneously active three-dimensional scanning systems, each one equipped with its own color analysis along a thin horizontal line and its own depth computation from three separate vantage points within the eye itself. What any of that feels like from the inside we do not know. There is no language that I am aware of in any human tradition that describes it. The midband, which is where the color work happens, has a specific behavior that is worth describing before we get into what the colors themselves are actually doing. When a stomatopod wants to examine an object, a potential prey item, a rival, a piece of possible food that has landed near the burrow, it does not hold its eye still and sample the object with the whole retina at once. It moves the eye in a specific scanning motion, sweeping the thin horizontal strip of the midband across the object in a sequence of small pitch and yaw rotations. The effect is something like running a single-line scanner across an image. The 12 photoreceptor types sample the object's spectrum one narrow slice at a time as the eye sweeps over it. Each slice produces a signal. The signals are sent back into the brain, where presumably something happens with them. What that something is, we will get into properly in a little while, because the answer is not what anyone had expected. It is not what the 16-color receptor claim implies. It is not what the early speculation in the 1990s guessed it would be. When researchers finally worked out, through careful behavioral experiments, what the animal was actually doing with all of that spectral information, the result was one of the more interesting sensory biology surprises of the last 15 years. The color channel count is real. The sophistication of the midband is real. The way the eye gathers information is real. What the animal does with the information after it is gathered turned out to be something stranger than a richer version of human color vision. It turned out to be a genuinely different strategy for solving the same problem, and the strategy does not quite do what most people assume color vision is supposed to do. The first step toward that finding was someone asking in the early 2010s a question that sounds almost naive. If this animal really does have 12 color channels, can it actually tell colors apart any better than we can with our 3? The question had not been asked in quite that form before. The answer, when it came back, changed how the field thought about color vision. But that is ahead of us. For now, the eyes are enough. 2 of them, each on its own stalk, moving independently of each other. A 6-row midband in each eye, 12 color channels in the midband, 3 pseudopupils within each eye, depth perception in a single eye, depth perception from two eyes at once, and the whole apparatus aimed at any given moment on a reef in two different directions, processing two different parts of the visual scene, and somehow sending a coherent enough picture back to the animal's small brain that the animal, seconds later, can launch a spring-loaded club at exactly the right distance, at exactly the right instant, at exactly the right target. The eyes are, by a reasonable measure, the most spectrally rich visual apparatus in the animal kingdom. The question of what they are actually for is the more interesting one. The question that Hannah Thoen asked sometime around 2013 was almost embarrassingly simple. If this animal really has 12 color channels to our 3, if it really is perceiving a spectral landscape 4 times richer than anything a human eye can build, can it actually tell colors apart better than we can? Thoen was a doctoral student in the visual neuroscience group at the University of Queensland, working under Justin Marshall, who had spent most of his career studying the eyes of reef animals. The Marshall Laboratory had been part of the original team back in the late 1980s that first characterized the 12 photoreceptor types in the stomatopod midband. Marshall knew the anatomy as well as anyone alive. He had also noticed over the years that the laboratory had never really tested the obvious question. Everyone had assumed the answer. 12 receptors must mean finer color discrimination. It must mean the animal is seeing distinctions we cannot see. The richness of the hardware had stood by itself as the argument. The experiment Thoen designed was straightforward. The Mantis shrimp subjects were trained to associate a specific color, say a particular shade of yellow, with food. When the animal approached the correct color, it received a small piece of fish. When it approached any other color, nothing happened. After a few weeks of training, the animal reliably went for the yellow. This was nothing new. Mantis shrimp are quick to learn simple associations of this kind, and the technique had been used in visual experiments on this species for decades. The new part was what Thoen did next. Once the animal had learned to pick out the trained yellow, she started presenting it with pairs of colored tubes, one of them reflecting the trained yellow, the other reflecting a color progressively closer and closer to yellow. Slightly greener yellow, slightly redder yellow, yellows that differed by smaller and smaller amounts, measured in nanometers of peak wavelength. If the animal really could discriminate colors more finely than a human, then, as the wavelengths of the two tubes approached each other, the mantis shrimp should have kept choosing the correct one, all the way down to color differences much finer than a human being could detect. At some point, a human would start making mistakes. A mantis shrimp, with its 12 receptors, should go on being right. That is not what happened. The mantis shrimp continued to discriminate colors accurately as long as the two test colors were reasonably far apart in wavelength, 25 nanometers or more, say, or about the difference between a true yellow and a clearly greenish yellow. Once the colors got closer than that, the animal began to make mistakes. By the time the two tubes were separated by 15 nanometers, the mantis shrimp was no better than chance. A human being, by comparison, can discriminate color differences of 1 to 4 nanometers across much of the visible spectrum. The animal with 12 photoreceptors was, on this specific test, 4 to 10 times worse at telling colors apart than a human being with 3. Thoen, Marshall and their collaborators published the finding in Science in January of 2014, under the title A Different Form of Color Vision in Mantis Shrimp. The title was carefully chosen. The point of the paper was not that the mantis shrimp has bad color vision. The point was that the mantis shrimp has a color vision system that is built on a completely different principle from the one humans and other vertebrates use, and that the principle it is built on has different strengths. The standard animal approach to color, the one our own visual system uses, is called opponent processing. 3 photoreceptors, each tuned to a different part of the spectrum, feed their signals into neural circuits that compare the photoreceptor outputs against each other. The brain does not know directly what wavelength of light hit the retina. It knows the ratio of signals coming from the red cones versus the green cones versus the blue cones, and it uses that ratio, computed continuously in the visual cortex, to construct the experience we call color. This is how 3 photoreceptors can discriminate millions of hues. The information is not in the receptors themselves, but in the comparisons between them. Fine discrimination is what the comparison system is for. Add a 4th receptor, the way some birds have, and the comparisons get richer. Add 12, and you would expect, naively, an enormous improvement in discrimination. The naive expectation is wrong. The naive expectation assumes the 12-receptor animal would also be doing opponent processing, and the mantis shrimp, as far as Thoen's results could tell, is not. What the mantis shrimp appears to be doing instead is running each of its 12 receptors more or less independently and treating the signal from each one as a kind of standalone detector for that particular narrow band of wavelengths. When light of the right wavelength hits the right row of the midband, the receptor fires. The animal recognizes the color by which receptor fired, rather than by computing ratios between receptors. The scanning motion of the midband, the pitch and yaw sweep that each eye performs across objects of interest, serves this strategy. The animal is passing its row of narrow band detectors across an object, reading out a sequence of wavelength-specific responses and identifying the object by the pattern of which receptors responded along the scan. It is, in engineering terms, less like a comparison-based color camera and more like a spectral scanner, running a direct frequency analysis without the intermediate ratio computation. This has interesting consequences. A system built on direct detection does not, in principle, need the heavy neural machinery that opponent processing requires. Opponent processing is computationally expensive. The brain has to hold multiple signals simultaneously, compute their ratios, and adjust for context, illumination, and spatial variation. The mantis shrimp, with its small brain and its large number of receptors, has traded one kind of sophistication for another. It has simpler color processing, but more channels. It cannot discriminate fine color differences, but it can identify familiar colors very quickly, much faster, potentially, than a comparison-based system of the kind vertebrates use. And for an animal whose predatory success depends on identifying in milliseconds whether the small moving thing in front of it is prey or rival or irrelevant, speed of identification may matter far more than fineness of discrimination. This is the point at which the story of mantis shrimp color vision reorganizes itself. The viral version of the story, the one that took hold in the early 2010s and has been repeated ever since, treated the stomatopod's 12 photoreceptors as evidence that this animal sees colors we cannot even imagine. It was an appealing idea. It was presented in some of the more widely shared accounts as though the animal lived in a richer visual universe than ours. Colors that humans would have to invent new words for, distinctions we could not begin to access, a chromatic experience so far above our own that the only appropriate response was humility. The most famous version of this framing appeared in a popular online comic in 2013, which praised the mantis shrimp's eye in extravagant terms and left millions of readers with the impression that this creature had, in evolutionary roulette, drawn a far better hand than we had. The comic was and remains charming. It was also, on the specific point about color vision, wrong in an interesting direction. The animal does not see colors we cannot imagine. The animal sees colors roughly like the ones we see, with some extension into the ultraviolet that we do not have, but with considerably less ability to tell nearby colors apart than we have. If you handed a mantis shrimp and a human the same paint sample book and asked them to sort the yellows, the human would do a better job. The mantis shrimp would get the broad categories right and fail on the fine gradations. Its system is not built for the kind of discrimination a paint sample book tests. What the mantis shrimp's system is apparently built for is something else. It is built for recognizing specific, behaviorally important colors very quickly in a visually complex environment with a minimum of neural computation. On a reef, where colors carry species-specific meaning, where a particular shade of blue on a body pattern is the signal that an aggressive rival is present, where a particular shade of green on a distant shape is a clue that a cephalopod has come into striking range. Being able to identify the relevant color immediately is more useful than being able to tell it apart from 36 similar but irrelevant colors. The animal does not need to know whether the other shrimp is a slightly different shade of teal. The animal needs to know that the other shrimp is teal at all, and to know it in milliseconds, so that the decision to strike or retreat can be made before the other shrimp has finished its own decision. This is the insight that Thoen's paper introduced into the field, and it has held up in the decades since. Subsequent work by other groups has extended the picture. A follow-up study by Rikesh Patel and Thomas Cronin, published in 2021, showed that when mantis shrimp are given a choice between recognizing an object by its color or by its shape, they prefer shape. Color for this animal seems to function less as the primary descriptor of an object and more as a kind of quick identifier, a fast yes or no check layered on top of shape-based recognition. The spectral richness of the eye, in other words, is not there to render the world in more nuance. It is there to make certain important recognitions faster. There is something worth saying about this that is easy to miss, and it points at a broader lesson about sensory biology. Complexity in a sensory organ does not automatically mean superiority. The sophistication of an eye has to be understood in relation to the specific problem the animal is using the eye to solve. Human color vision is built for one kind of problem, distinguishing fine gradations of reflectance in a relatively stable visual environment under varying light across objects we interact with slowly and deliberately. Stomatopod color vision is built for a different kind of problem. Rapid identification of behaviorally significant wavelengths in a visually cluttered underwater environment under a specific light regime across objects and other animals that have to be categorized in milliseconds. Neither system is better than the other in any absolute sense. Each is an answer to a different question. The mantis shrimp eye is one of the more spectacular pieces of biological optics ever assembled, and the popular interest in it is entirely earned. It is also a useful reminder that the word better, in the context of sensory systems, is almost always the wrong word. The word that actually applies is different. This animal has been working across hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary editing on a visual system suited to its specific way of being alive. That system includes 12 photoreceptor types, a scanning midband, 3 pseudopupils per eye, independent eye motion, and a host of other features we have not yet discussed, including one that no other animal has ever been shown to possess, and which may, in some ways, be the most genuinely alien part of the whole apparatus. It has to do with the 2 rows of the midband we have not yet talked about, rows 5 and 6 down at the bottom of the scanning strip, doing work that is not about color at all. It has to do with a property of light that most animals cannot detect, and that this one apparently can in a form that appears, as far as anyone has been able to determine, to be unique to stomatopods. It has to do with what these animals may be saying to each other, quietly, in a channel that nothing else in the ocean can read. There is a property of light that most of us never think about because we cannot see it, and because, for most purposes, it does not affect our ordinary experience of the world. Light, when it travels through empty space or through a transparent medium like air or water, does not travel as a simple line. It oscillates. The electric field of a light wave vibrates perpendicular to the direction the wave is moving, and the orientation of that vibration, whether it is wobbling up and down, or side to side, or at some angle between the two, is a real physical property of the light. Physicists call this property polarization. Most animals, including human beings, are completely blind to it. Our eyes respond to the wavelength of light, which we experience as color, and to the intensity of light, which we experience as brightness, and to essentially nothing else. The polarization of the light hitting our retinas is simply not available to us. It arrives, it is absorbed, and we never know it was there. This is unusual in the animal kingdom. Quite a lot of other animals can see polarized light, at least in the simpler form physicists call linear polarization, the kind where the light's electric field is oscillating along a single flat plane. Honeybees use linearly polarized light to navigate by the sun on overcast days because the polarization pattern in the sky above the clouds preserves information about where the sun is. Desert ants do something similar, using the polarization of skylight to keep their bearings during long foraging trips across featureless terrain. Octopuses and cuttlefish use polarization vision to detect prey whose camouflage breaks down under polarized light, even when the prey appears invisible under ordinary light. Certain species of fish and many species of insects share some version of this ability. Polarization vision, once you start looking for it, turns out to be fairly widely distributed across the animal kingdom. It is an old and useful trick, and evolution has reinvented it many times. What evolution has apparently only invented once, as far as any study has been able to determine across every animal ever tested, is the ability to see a second and weirder kind of polarization called circular polarization. Circular polarization is the form of polarization in which the electric field of the light wave is not oscillating along a single flat plane at all, but is rotating. Like a corkscrew, the wave moves forward and the field spins, clockwise or counterclockwise depending on the handedness of the polarization, and the two handednesses, right circular and left circular, are as different, optically, as red and green are to a human eye. To a human eye, naturally, they are invisible. To almost every animal that has ever been tested, they are invisible. The mantis shrimp can see them. This finding came out of the laboratory of Chih-Hui Chiu, working with Justin Marshall's group, and was published in Current Biology in 2008. The team had spent years characterizing the polarization-sensitive rows of the stomatopod midband, the two rows at the bottom of the scanning strip that we mentioned earlier, rows 5 and 6, which do not handle color at all. What Chiu and colleagues worked out was that a specific architectural feature of those rows, a particular arrangement of the cellular structures inside the photoreceptors, in which one cell acts as a physical rotator of the incoming light, functions, in optical terms, as a quarter-wave retarder. A quarter-wave retarder is a device that converts circularly polarized light into linearly polarized light. Physics laboratories buy them as small glass plates at considerable expense for experiments in optics. The mantis shrimp grows them at no charge inside its own eyes. Light enters the eye. If it is circularly polarized, one of the cells rotates it. The downstream cells, which are sensitive to linear polarization, then read the rotated light as a specific linear orientation. The animal does not, as far as anyone can tell, have a separate system for circular polarization. It has a linear polarization system with a built-in optical converter, and the conversion happens automatically every time light passes through the rotating cell. The result is that the animal can distinguish right circular from left circular polarization as effortlessly as you or I distinguish red from green. No other animal has been shown to do this. Every other polarization-sensitive creature so far tested sees linear polarization only. The mantis shrimp sees both kinds. It is, as of this writing, the sole known possessor of circular polarization vision on this planet. The immediate question, the one that anyone who works on this problem has to confront, is what the animal is using the ability for. Seeing is expensive. Eyes and their supporting neural hardware take resources to build and maintain, and evolution does not typically preserve costly features that are not doing any work. If the mantis shrimp has built an optical system capable of detecting circular polarization and has preserved that system across multiple species and across considerable evolutionary time, then there is, presumably, something the animal is doing with the ability that justifies the investment. For a long time, no one knew what. The hypothesis, which was floated early and has now been at least partially confirmed, was that the mantis shrimp uses circular polarization for communication. The logic goes something like this. On a reef, visual signals are valuable but dangerous. An animal that advertises its presence with a bright body pattern, or a distinctive color, or a coordinated behavioral display, is broadcasting information that its intended recipient can use, a potential mate, a rival whose intentions need to be assessed, a conspecific whose identity needs to be confirmed. The broadcast, unfortunately, also reaches any other animal with a working visual system. Predators can see the signal, prey can see the signal, rivals outside of the intended audience can eavesdrop. The reef is full of eyes, most of them not the intended recipients, and most of those unintended recipients would be happy to make use of the information if they could. What an animal would like in this situation is a private channel. A signal that the intended recipient can read clearly and that everything else cannot read at all. Circular polarization is, essentially, that channel. Because no other animal on the reef can detect the difference between right circular and left circular light, an animal that produces circularly polarized body patterns has, in effect, a signaling medium that is invisible to its entire predator and prey community. Only its own species can see it. A circularly polarized display is a message broadcast in a language that no one else speaks. In 2015, a team including Yakir Gagnon, Nicholas Roberts, Martin Howe, Zhihui Qiu, and Justin Marshall published, again in Current Biology, what was at the time the first direct behavioral evidence that mantis shrimp actually use circular polarization for communication. The species they worked with, Gonadactylaceus falcatus, is a small smasher common across the tropical Pacific. The experimenters set up a choice test in which animals seeking refuge in a burrow were presented with two apparently identical entrances, distinguished only by whether the interior of the burrow reflected right circular or left circular polarized light. The animals, presented with this choice, consistently avoided one of the two burrows. Specifically, they avoided burrows that were reflecting the same circular polarization pattern that the species itself produces on its body, a pattern that, in the wild, would signal to an incoming animal that another Gonadactylaceus falcatus was already in residence. The behavior is subtle but unambiguous. The animals were reading the circular polarization signal, interpreting it as a marker of conspecific occupancy and acting on the information. The channel is not only there, it is working. Subsequent work has extended this picture in several directions. Different stomatopod species have been found to produce circularly polarized reflections from different body parts, the keel of the telson in some species, the merle spots on the raptorial appendages in others, the carapace in yet others, and the reflections are often sex-specific, with males producing stronger or differently oriented reflections than females of the same species. The signals appear to play roles in mate recognition, territorial communication, and species identification across a visually cluttered environment in which many closely related stomatopods coexist. Field observations conducted on reefs in the Indo-Pacific have documented mantis shrimp approaching potential mates or rivals in characteristic postures that maximize the visibility of their circularly polarized reflections to the other animal's eyes. The display behavior exists. The signal behavior exists. The whole system, as far as anyone can tell, is a functioning private communication channel running in a frequency of light that nothing else in the ocean can read. There is something genuinely strange about this, worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine, if you can, a human community that had evolved alongside ordinary speech, a second language that used sounds outside the range of every other species on Earth, and also outside the range of most human ears. Imagine that this second language was used primarily for the most delicate business of human social life: courtship, territorial negotiation, the identification of one's own family against strangers. Imagine that every member of this community was fluent in the second language, that the first language served for ordinary business and the second language for intimate business, and that no other creature on the planet, no dog, no bird, no primate, no eavesdropping neighbor, could hear the second language at all. That is, roughly, what is happening on the reef when two mantis shrimp meet each other. They have the ordinary visual channel, which they share with most of the rest of the reef's visual animals. They also have a second, private, circularly polarized channel, which runs across body patterns they have developed specifically to exploit it, and which carries some portion of the information that matters most to their own species: who is who wants what, who is already living in that burrow. The rest of the reef does not know the second channel exists. It has been there, producing and receiving meaningful information for however long the mantis shrimp have been producing and receiving meaningful information, quite possibly tens of millions of years. The biological machinery that makes this possible is part of what makes it strange. Not one system, but two, operating in parallel inside the same eye. The color channels in the upper 4 rows of the midband doing their narrowband rapid identification work. The polarization channels in rows 5 and 6 doing their circular and linear polarization work. A physical retarder cell sitting inside each polarization-sensitive ommatidium, converting circularly polarized light into linearly polarized light at the moment of detection. A neural processing system capable of reading both streams, presumably integrating them into a single impression of the reef's visual scene, and using that integrated impression to guide decisions that have to be made in milliseconds. All of this compressed into an eye roughly the size of a peppercorn. There is a thought that goes with all of this, which tends to come up whenever people try to describe the mantis shrimp's sensory world to a general audience, and which is worth saying plainly, even though it cannot quite be resolved. The animal sees things we cannot see. It communicates in a channel we cannot read. The ordinary vocabulary of human visual experience, color, brightness, contrast, applies to the animal only approximately. The channels the animal has that we do not have, and the absence of some of the channels we have that the animal does not have, add up to a kind of visual experience that no human has ever had and no human language has words for. What it is like to be a mantis shrimp, in the sense of having the animal's eyes from the inside, is a question that will probably never have an answer we can verify. We can describe the equipment. We can describe the signals the equipment carries. What the animal does, inside itself with any of it, whether there is an inside itself at all in the way that question tends to be asked, is beyond what we have the tools to reach. What we can say is that the equipment is real, the circular polarization vision is real, the private signaling channel is real. The animal has been using both for a very long time against a background of reef traffic that has never noticed any of it. The reef above the burrow continues its ordinary business. The small fish go by, the wrasses pick at things, the occasional octopus glides through looking for something to eat. None of them see the signals the mantis shrimp is exchanging with a potential mate 2 meters away or with a rival 3 meters in the other direction. The signals are exchanged anyway. The reef has its public life and its private life, and the private life is kept private in broad daylight by a piece of optics the size of a seed. In 2017, a team of neuroscientists at the University of Arizona, led by Nicholas Strausfeld, published a paper in the journal eLife that was, on its surface, a fairly technical piece of comparative anatomy. The paper examined the internal structure of the brain of a mantis shrimp, specifically Gonodactylus smithii, a common smasher from the reefs of northern Australia, and compared that structure to the brains of a wide range of other arthropods. Crabs, shrimp, lobsters, hermit crabs, pistol shrimp, and a number of insects were included for reference. The methods were microscopy and neuroanatomical staining of the careful and unspectacular kind that takes months of laboratory work and produces its findings in the form of labeled tissue sections and comparative diagrams. Nothing about the paper, from its title or its abstract, suggested that it was going to quietly unsettle a settled chapter of evolutionary biology. What the Strausfeld group found inside the small brain of the mantis shrimp was a pair of structures that had no business being there. The structures are called mushroom bodies. They are, in the vertebrate-centric vocabulary of most undergraduate biology textbooks, one of the classic examples of an invertebrate neural specialization, a pair of densely packed clusters of small neurons, usually positioned in the forebrain, which in insects have been extensively studied for their role in learning, memory formation, and multisensory integration. A honeybee's mushroom bodies are what allow the bee to remember the location of a flower patch across days. A fruit fly's mushroom bodies are what allow the fly to learn to avoid an odor associated with a bad experience. Mushroom bodies, in insects, are the seat of a substantial portion of what we would call, if we were being generous with the word, the insect's mind. And mushroom bodies, as every comparative neuroanatomy textbook had confidently said for several decades, were exclusively an insect feature. They were not found in crustaceans. They had not been found in any of the many crustacean brains that had been carefully examined over the years. The absence of mushroom bodies in crustaceans was one of the standard pieces of evidence that insects and crustaceans, despite sharing a common ancestor somewhere back in the Cambrian, had followed very different paths in the evolution of their nervous systems. Insects had invented mushroom bodies, crustaceans had not. The division was clean, the textbooks were in agreement, and the evolutionary story built on that division was one of the more stable pieces of the comparative literature. Strausfeld's group found mushroom bodies in the mantis shrimp. The structures were not vestigial. They were not ambiguous homologues of something else that happened to resemble mushroom bodies on casual inspection. They were mushroom bodies in the full textbook sense. The correct gross morphology, the correct cellular composition, the correct position within the brain, the correct molecular markers when the team went looking for those. The structures were, by every standard that had been used to define mushroom bodies in insects for a century, the same structures, and they were sitting in the brain of a crustacean that had diverged from the insect lineage more than 500 million years ago. The finding did not stop at the mantis shrimp. Once Straussfeld and his colleagues knew what to look for, they re-examined the brains of other crustaceans, cleaner shrimp, pistol shrimp, hermit crabs, and a number of related species, and found mushroom bodies or close analogues of them in several of those as well. The effect was cumulative. The textbook division between insects and crustaceans on this point was not holding up. Either mushroom bodies had evolved multiple times in parallel in several different arthropod lineages, which would be one of the more striking cases of convergent evolution in the animal kingdom, or mushroom bodies were a much older and more conserved feature than anyone had realized, present in the common ancestor of insects and crustaceans more than 500 million years ago, and preserved in some descendants, lost in others, overlooked in still others, until the right person went looking for them. Either conclusion rewrites a piece of the story that had seemed settled. The Straussfeld paper was careful not to pick a side. The authors presented both possibilities as live and left the sorting out of which one was correct to the wider community. The community is still sorting it out. What the paper established beyond any reasonable doubt was the basic fact. The mantis shrimp has, inside its small head, a piece of neural architecture that was supposed to belong to insects and nobody else, and which is associated, in the animals that have it, with some of the most interesting cognitive work in the invertebrate world. This is one of those findings that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. It is not that the mushroom body is by itself a piece of dramatic brain machinery. Mushroom bodies are small. In a mantis shrimp, they occupy a fraction of the total brain volume. They do not, in any sense, make the animal into a brilliant thinker. What they do is give the animal a specific kind of neural real estate, a dedicated region optimized for the formation and retrieval of associative memories, the kind that link a sensory input to a past experience, or a location to a reward, or a specific individual to a past encounter. The presence of mushroom bodies in a brain is a reasonable indicator that the animal is doing this kind of memory work. The mantis shrimp, it turns out, is a separate line of research conducted across much of the same period by Thomas Cronin's laboratory at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, had been slowly piecing together the cognitive and navigational abilities of stomatopods in the field and in the laboratory. Cronin's graduate student Rikesh Patel, whose name has come up before in this story, had been working specifically on spatial navigation in Neogonodactylus oestdii, a small smasher common in shallow Caribbean reefs. Patel's question was straightforward. When a mantis shrimp leaves its burrow to hunt and wanders through the three-dimensional clutter of a reef for minutes at a time, how does it find its way back? The answer, which emerged across a series of papers published in Current Biology and the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 2020 and 2021, turned out to involve a combination of mechanisms that were, until Patel's work, not known to operate together in any marine animal. Part of the answer is path integration. Path integration is a navigational strategy that desert ants and honeybees are famous for. The animal keeps a running internal record of every movement it makes, every step, every turn, every short flight, and uses that record to maintain a continuously updated vector pointing from its current position back to its starting point. At any moment, the animal knows approximately where home is, not because it can see home, but because it has been keeping track of its own motion the whole time. When the animal needs to return, it simply follows the vector. Path integration is a neurally expensive strategy because it requires the animal to maintain accurate sensory information about its own movement at all times, and to combine that information continuously into an updated home direction. Desert ants do it. Honeybees do it. Nothing in water had been shown to do it until Patel showed that mantis shrimp do it as well. The mantis shrimp do something more. When Patel examined the sensory cues the animals were using to maintain their internal compass, the answer turned out to involve the sun, where the sun was visible through the water, and the polarization pattern of the overhead sky, where the sun was not directly visible. The mantis shrimp, in other words, are navigating using the same kind of celestial compass that desert ants use above ground, adapted to work through several meters of water and through the refraction and scattering that the water imposes. They read the polarization of the overhead sky, compute an absolute compass direction from it, and combine that direction with their internal record of their own motion to produce a running estimate of where home is. When the overhead sky is available, they use it. When it is not, when clouds block the sun, or when the animal is deep in a crevice and cannot see upward, they fall back on purely internal cues, the same idiothetic sense of motion that a mammal uses when walking through a dark room. The hierarchy of cues is the same hierarchy that insect navigators use. The implementation in a marine animal whose ancestors diverged from the insect line more than 500 million years ago is almost eerily similar. A further paper published in 2021 added landmark recognition to the picture. When Patel placed a visual landmark near a mantis shrimp's burrow, a simple vertical cylinder with black and white stripes, the animals learned to use the landmark as an additional reference, and when the experimenters displaced the landmark, the animals' homeward paths shifted accordingly. The landmarks were being recognized as landmarks. The animals were integrating them into their navigational picture. In a related experiment, Patel and Cronin showed that when mantis shrimp are asked to recognize an object, to tell one visual target from another in a trained discrimination task, they rely more heavily on the shape of the object than on its color. This is a small finding, but it sits neatly with the color vision reframe from the Thoen work. The mantis shrimp's color system is optimized for rapid identification of specific relevant wavelengths, not for fine discrimination. Its object recognition system is optimized around shape. The two systems complement each other, and between them they produce an animal that knows where it is, where it has been, what it is looking at, and what that object is for. This is the picture that has been assembling itself slowly across the last 15 years of stomatopod neuroscience. An animal with mushroom bodies, doing the associative learning those structures are known for. An animal with path integration, maintaining a running sense of its own position in space. An animal with celestial compass navigation, reading the polarized sky pattern as a directional reference. An animal with landmark learning, using visual features of its environment as fixed reference points. An animal with shape-based object recognition, identifying things by their form rather than by their color. All of this packed into a brain roughly the size of a grain of rice, operating in a small crustacean body on a reef that the animal has been mapping and remembering for the entire duration of its life. There is a further wrinkle, which was added in 2019 by a team including Strausfeld and several collaborators. In addition to the mushroom bodies, the mantis shrimp brain contains a second structure, a pair of bodies, kidney-shaped under the microscope, positioned within the eye stalks themselves, closer to the sensory input than the mushroom bodies are. The team called them reniform bodies, from the Latin ren for kidney. Work in crabs, published a few years earlier, had suggested that reniform bodies might serve as a secondary learning and memory center, distinct from mushroom bodies and possibly handling a different kind of information. In the mantis shrimp, the reniform bodies are well developed. They sit in a position that suggests they are integrating visual information at an early stage in the processing stream and passing some of it along to the mushroom bodies for longer-term storage. The precise division of labor between the two structures is still being worked out. What the anatomical picture establishes is that the mantis shrimp's brain has not one but two dedicated memory and learning regions, at two different points in the sensory processing hierarchy, both of them unusually well developed for the animal's brain size. This is, cumulatively, a substantial revision of the older picture of what this animal is. The picture of the mantis shrimp as a small, fierce, mostly reflexive predator, all spring and strike, driven by a few hardwired triggers, does not survive contact with the recent cognitive work. What survives instead is an animal that is keeping careful track of its world. It knows its burrow. It knows the reef around the burrow in some detail. It knows the individuals who live near it and remembers specific recent encounters with them. It knows where the sun is or where it was the last time the sky was visible. It maintains a running internal sense of its own position across minutes of wandering through complex terrain and can return home by dead reckoning even when no visual landmarks are available. It learns quickly, remembers for considerable periods, and uses all of this information to make decisions that are genuinely cognitive rather than purely reactive. An animal built this way does not deploy a weapon like the one described in the first half of this story casually. It cannot afford to. A decision to strike, for a mantis shrimp, is a decision being made by an animal that is tracking the identity of the thing in front of it, the identity of other animals in the neighborhood, the recent history of its own encounters, the position of its burrow, and the current state of its own physiological readiness. The strike, when it comes, is the output of a considerable amount of cognitive work. The strike is not the animal. The animal is the thing doing the cognitive work, and the strike is one of several things that cognitive work can produce. This is worth keeping in mind for what comes next, because most of the behavior that has been studied in this species, and most of the behavior that makes this species famous, involves encounters between mantis shrimp and other mantis shrimp, encounters in which both animals have the kind of cognitive apparatus we have just been describing. Both animals have weapons that can inflict severe damage, and both animals have very good reasons not to use those weapons at full force against each other. The way these encounters are resolved in the wild is one of the more interesting things that has been worked out about this species, and it involves a ritual that, once you see it, reframes almost everything about what the strike is actually for. Picture two mantis shrimp of roughly the same size meeting at the border of their territories on a Caribbean reef. Both are smashers. Both are Neogonodactylus bredini, a small, abundant species that has been the subject of more behavioral research than almost any other stomatopod. Each of them has, folded under its head, the spring-loaded club that we have spent the better part of this story describing. Each of them, in principle, could kill the other with a single, well-placed strike. Neither of them is going to. What happens instead is one of the more carefully studied rituals in invertebrate behavior, and once you have watched it a few times, it starts to look less like a fight and more like a negotiation conducted in a medium that happens to be violent. The opening move is called the merrill spread. The merrill is the segment of the raptorial appendage that holds the loaded spring, and on most smashers, the underside of the merrill carries a brightly coloured patch. In bredini, it is usually a vivid purple, sometimes with a yellow or white border. When two animals meet and one of them wants to make its presence known, it lifts its appendages forward and turns them slightly outward, exposing the morale patches in a display that is essentially impossible to miss. The gesture is the mantis shrimp equivalent of a raised fist, except that what is being shown is not the fist itself, but the loaded spring behind it. The merrill spread does not hide the weapon, it advertises the weapon. In many encounters, the display is enough. One of the animals reads the other's merrill spread, decides that the fight is not worth the risk, and retreats. The whole interaction lasts a few seconds. No strikes are thrown. Both animals go back to what they were doing, with the territorial boundary between them slightly adjusted based on who backed down. For a long time, it was assumed that this was how most disputes between size-matched mantis shrimp ended, through display, with the loser reading the winner's posture and withdrawing before any damage could be done. The Merrill spread was understood as an honest signal of strength, and the animals were understood as respecting the signal. The picture turned out to be incomplete. When Patrick Green and Sheila Patek looked carefully at what happens in size-matched encounters between animals that are close enough in size that the Merrill spread does not clearly favor one over the other, they found that the display alone rarely settled the dispute. The animals would exchange Merrill spreads, and then, far more often than the older picture suggested, they would proceed to the next stage of the interaction, which was to start hitting each other. The hitting is not done the way you might expect. When two mantis shrimp have decided that a dispute will not be resolved by display, they adopt a specific set of postures. One animal, the aggressor for the moment, positions itself in front of the other. The second animal, the defender, curls its tail plate forward, tucking it in front of its body so that the plate is presented toward the aggressor like a small shield. The tail plate is called the telson, and in the posture the defender adopts, it is held in what the literature calls the telson coil, a specific defensive stance observable in dozens of stomatopod species that has been photographed and filmed and described in careful detail by Roy Caldwell and his students over the better part of 50 years. Then the aggressor hits the telson. The strike is a full commitment. The aggressor loads its spring, triggers the release, and delivers a 1,000-Newton blow directly onto the defender's presented telson plate. The defender absorbs the strike. The two animals hold their positions. A moment later, the roles reverse. The defender, still in its coiled posture, rotates in the water, presents its own appendage, and delivers its own strike to the aggressor's telson. Back and forth, taking turns, until one of the animals decides it has had enough and retreats. The pattern is so consistent that Green and Patek, in their 2015 paper in Biology Letters, coined a specific term for it. They called it telson sparring. The word sparring was chosen deliberately. What the animals are doing is structurally identical in its ritualized turn-taking and its deliberate placement of the blow to the sparring rounds that human fighters do in training, except that the blows are real and the weapons are loaded, and nobody, somehow, ends up dead. The question of why the telson can absorb what it absorbs without catastrophic damage to the animal holding it is one of the more interesting parallel puzzles in stomatopod biology. The telson is not made of anything exotic. It is the same mineralized chitin that makes up the rest of the animal's exoskeleton, arranged in a similar general way. What is different about the telson is how the material is laid out. The plate is stiff at its outer edge, where the strike lands, and becomes progressively more compliant toward its inner attachment to the body. The outer stiffness distributes the force of the impact across a wide area, rather than allowing it to focus on a single point. The inner compliance absorbs the residual energy that makes it pass the outer plate, dissipating it through a combination of structural deformation and elastic rebound. The animal does not experience the full force of the strike as a single violent event in its body. It experiences something closer to a heavy, absorbed shock, uncomfortable but survivable. There is a further detail worth mentioning because it has reshaped a hypothesis that was current for several decades. The older view was that the telson had evolved specifically to handle telson sparring, that the animal's habit of hitting each other on the tail plate had driven the evolution of a tail plate capable of taking those hits. This was a natural hypothesis. It fit the general pattern of evolutionary coevolution between weapon and armor that had been described in other species. It also turned out not to be supported by the data. In 2019, Jennifer Taylor and colleagues published a phylogenetic comparison in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface, in which they measured the impact resistance of telsons across many stomatopod species, including smashers, which engage in telson sparring, and spearers, which do not. If the coevolutionary hypothesis were correct, the sparring species should have had measurably tougher telsons than the non-sparring species. They did not. The impact resistance of the telson was, within the range of the studied species, essentially the same regardless of whether the species engaged in sparring behavior. What this appeared to mean was that the telson had already been a heavily armored structure for reasons that predated sparring behavior, and that sparring had arisen because the armor was already there, not the other way around. The animals had not evolved tougher tails to handle fights. The animals had started having a specific kind of fight because their tails were already tough enough to take it. This is a subtle point, but it matters for how we think about the behavior. Telson sparring is not a recent solution to an old problem. It is more like a repurposing of existing equipment for a new use. The telson was built for other reasons, likely general protection of the animal's posterior end from incoming threats, of which there are many on a reef, and the ritualized combat behavior emerged because the equipment happened to be available. Once sparring became part of the behavioral repertoire of smasher species, it became a reliable way to resolve territorial disputes without anyone getting killed, and it has been preserved across the smasher lineages ever since. The telson is older than the ritual. The ritual found the telson. What the ritual accomplishes when it works is an honest exchange of information about who is more willing and able to keep fighting. A small, injured or otherwise compromised animal will, in the course of exchanging strikes, become visibly less effective. Its strikes will lose force. Its posture will start to fail. Its willingness to receive the next incoming blow will deteriorate. The opponent reads these signals across the back and forth of the sparring sequence and adjusts its own behavior accordingly. If the opponent can see that the other animal is flagging, it will escalate, press the attack, commit to harder strikes, hold its ground through the defender's return blows. If the opponent sees that the other animal is strong and committed, it will eventually disengage. The longer the sparring goes on, the more information the animals accumulate about each other. At some point, one of them decides the information is conclusive. That animal withdraws. The territorial boundary shifts or stays where it was. Both animals go on living. Compare this to what happens if the ritual breaks down. If a mantis shrimp decides to strike a rival somewhere other than the telson, to hit the head, for example, or to aim for the body rather than the armored plate, the outcome is not a negotiation. It is a killing. Unarmored parts of a mantis shrimp's body cannot absorb 1,000-Newton strike. A well-placed blow to the head will end the fight and the rival immediately. This happens occasionally in the wild. It is overwhelmingly the exception. The default behavior in smasher species is to strike the telson and only the telson, and to accept the return blow in kind. The default behavior, in other words, is to spar honestly, in a system that depends on both animals agreeing to the rules. The presence of these rules in a small solitary crustacean with no parental training and no social structure beyond the dyad of the current encounter is worth pausing on for a moment. There is no one teaching a juvenile mantis shrimp how to fight. The telson coil posture, the merle spread, the turn-taking of the strikes, the reading of the opponent's flagging performance. None of this is learned in any obvious cultural sense. All of it appears to be part of the animal's built-in behavioral repertoire, shaped over evolutionary time rather than transmitted through individual experience. Two animals who have never met before can conduct a full sparring encounter by rules that both of them already know without ever having been taught. This is the kind of behavioral heritage that is easy to underestimate. A ritual combat system is an impressive thing for a small crustacean brain to carry. It requires the animal to recognize a conspecific, read the conspecific's size and condition, commit to or decline the encounter based on that assessment, execute the correct postural sequence, deliver strikes at the correct intensity and placement, read the return strikes, update its estimate of the opponent, and decide when to disengage. Each of these steps is a cognitive operation, and all of them have to be chained together in real time under the pressure of a physical encounter with another animal who is also carrying out its own version of the same computations. Desert ants and honeybees have their own sophisticated behavioral repertoires, and those have been much studied. The mantis shrimp's behavioral repertoire has had less popular attention, but it is no less substantial. It is, in some respects, more so because the stakes are higher. A mistake in navigation costs a honeybee some foraging time, whereas a mistake in ritual combat can cost a mantis shrimp its life. Watching a Telson sparring match play out, on video or in an aquarium, is a slightly unsettling experience because it does not look the way a fight is supposed to look. Two animals face each other. One of them hits the other as hard as it can, in a specific place. The other animal does not flinch, does not try to escape, does not try to defend any other part of its body. It simply holds its telson in position and absorbs the blow. Then, without visible anger or visible fear, it returns the blow. The exchange can continue for many rounds. It has the rhythm of a test or an examination or something closer to an arbitration than a fight. The animals are clearly under stress. They are clearly evaluating each other. Neither of them is trying to hurt the other beyond what the system allows. At some point, one of them moves back. The other one holds position. The encounter is over. The boundary between the territories has been redrawn, or it has been reaffirmed. No one is dead. No one is seriously injured. The aquarium returns to its ambient activity, or the reef returns to its ambient activity, and within a few minutes the whole event has receded into the ordinary business of being a small armored predator on a crowded piece of substrate with neighbors. Most of what is remarkable about mantis shrimp in the popular account has to do with their weapons and their eyes. The behavior that fills the spaces between strikes and between glances, the maintenance of a territorial boundary, the slow work of neighbors deciding whether to escalate or stand down, the moment-to-moment accounting of who is larger, who is fresher from a recent molt, who has been eating well and who has not, tends to get less attention because it does not film as dramatically. It is nonetheless part of the animal's daily life, and for most mantis shrimp across most of their adult lives, it is the part of their existence that takes up the most time. The strikes are rare. The encounters are common. The ritual that keeps the encounters from becoming lethal is, in the end, one of the animal's most important pieces of equipment, and it has nothing to do with the club. For two animals who have, against the odds, been living alongside each other for years, not territorial rivals but something else, the negotiations are different in kind and last considerably longer. There is a mantis shrimp in the biology department at the University of California, Berkeley, who has been living in the same tank for most of her adult life. She is a zebra mantis shrimp of the species Lysiosquilina maculata, which is to say, a large spearer, long-bodied, banded in yellow and dark brown, the size of a human forearm when fully grown. She shares her tank with a male of the same species who has been there almost as long as she has. Neither animal is named, in the records that have been kept. Neither needs to be. In the lab where Roy Caldwell has spent most of his working life studying this family of animals, the pair is simply the Lisiosquilina pair, or sometimes the old pair, and everyone who has passed through the lab in the last 20 years knows who is being referred to. The two of them have been paired for the entire time the lab has been observing them, not as a convenience of housing, as a biological fact. They are, in the technical vocabulary of behavioral ecology, socially monogamous. They have shared a burrow continuously, raised young together in that burrow, coordinated their daily routines around each other's presence, and exhibited, across more than 2 decades of continuous observation, every behavioral marker that has been associated with long-term pair bonding in any other animal studied for this property. They are not unusual for their species. Lisiosquilina maculata and a handful of closely related Lisiosquilloid species are genuinely monogamous. In the wild, pairs of this species have been documented sharing the same burrow system for years, with the male hunting from the burrow entrance and the female remaining inside tending eggs in a division of labor that persists across multiple breeding cycles. The Berkeley pair are doing in captivity what the wild pairs do in the coral back reefs of the Indo-Pacific. What makes them remarkable is simply that they have been doing it in full view of researchers for long enough that the researchers have had time to watch it carefully. This is not what most people expect when they first hear it about this family of animals. A mantis shrimp, in the popular imagination and in most of the scientific framing of the last 50 years, is a solitary creature. The smasher species certainly behave this way. A peacock mantis shrimp, left in a tank with another peacock mantis shrimp of the same sex, will eventually kill the other one. Left with an animal of the opposite sex, it will mate, and then the two will separate, and each will return to its own burrow somewhere else on the reef. The peacock's social life, outside of the brief window of courtship, is a series of territorial boundaries and occasional ritualized disputes at those boundaries. It is not a creature built for company. The Lisiosquilloids are built differently, not all of them. The family includes species that behave more like peacocks, aggressive and solitary, but a specific subgroup, including Lisiosquilina maculata and several smaller relatives in the genera Pulosquilla and Nanosquilla, have evolved a way of life that runs on permanent pair bonds and shared parental care. A male and a female of these species meet, pair up, dig a long U-shaped burrow in sandy substrate, and then share that burrow for the rest of their lives. The burrows can reach 10 meters in length, with 2 openings at the surface and a long connecting tunnel below. Both animals contribute to the burrow's maintenance. The male typically does most of the active hunting, waiting at one of the burrow openings for small fish to pass within range of his long spearing appendages, then striking and retreating with the prey. The female, in most observed species, remains deeper in the burrow system, tending to eggs or to juveniles, though she will also hunt when circumstances favor it. When the male returns with prey, he does something that has been described in the field notes of more than one researcher who has watched it. He brings the prey to the female first. He does not eat it himself and then go out for more. He delivers it to her, allows her to take some or all of it, and only after that, depending on what is left, does he turn to his own needs. This is not a courtship behavior in the strict sense. The pair is not, at that moment, courting. They are, in the language of the field, simply being a pair, and one of the things pairs in this lineage do is share resources asymmetrically, in a way that consistently favors the female during periods when she is tending young. In the Berkeley lab, this provisioning pattern has been observed for the full duration of the pair's residence. The male hunts. The female eats first. The male eats what is left. They do this day after day, year after year, in a tank that has not changed in any significant way for longer than most graduate students take to finish their degrees. How long these pairs last in the wild is a more difficult question to answer. Lisioscelina maculata can live for 40 years or more under good conditions. Individual pairs have been tracked by divers on Indo-Pacific reefs for considerable stretches of time, 10 years, 15 years, in one much-cited case approaching 20 years, and in every such long-term observation, the same two animals have remained together. The sample sizes are small because the research is difficult and the animals are long-lived, but the pattern is clear. These are not seasonal pair bonds. They are not reproductive coalitions that dissolve when breeding is over. They are, as far as the limited human observations can determine, permanent. Two animals meet, form a bond, and stay bonded until one of them dies. In the lisiosquilloid species that have been studied most carefully, the second animal does not typically repair after a partner dies. It continues to hold the burrow alone for the remainder of its own life. There is something almost disorienting about this, set against everything else we have been describing about this family. The same lineage that produces the peacock mantis shrimp, the small, violent, brilliantly colored solitary predator that will kill any same-sex rival that enters its territory, also produces these quiet, monogamous, cooperating animals, sharing a burrow for decades, exchanging food, raising young together, and remaining together through a lifespan that, in human terms, would count as a substantial marriage. The two behavioral strategies sit side by side on the stomatopod family tree, neither one more primitive than the other, neither one the ancestral condition. They are alternative answers to the question of how a small armored predator can best propagate itself across geological time. Both answers have been working for tens of millions of years. The scientific study of this kind of monogamy in mantis shrimp has been led in recent decades by Molly Wright, a Caldwell student who spent the early part of her doctoral research in Moorea, a small island in French Polynesia, where the back reefs support dense populations of Pulasquilla littoralis and Pulasquilla thomasini. These are much smaller animals than Lisiosquilina maculata, no more than a few centimeters in length, but they are socially monogamous on the same pattern. Wright's field notes from the 2008 season describe pair after pair of small stomatopods, each pair sharing a single U-shaped burrow in the sand, each pair exhibiting the same cooperative division of labor that the larger lisiosquillids show. Wright's dissertation and the subsequent papers that came out of it established that the monogamy was not only social, the pairs staying together for purposes of cooperation and parental care, but also, in many cases, genetic. Paternity testing on egg clutches from paired females showed that the paired male was, overwhelmingly, the father of the eggs the female was tending. The pairs were not pretending to be exclusive while pursuing other options. They were, by the genetic record as well as the behavioral record, each other's only partners. This is one of the rarer findings in the behavioral ecology of invertebrates. Genuine genetic monogamy, as distinct from social monogamy, where animals cohabit but hedge reproductively, is uncommon across the animal kingdom as a whole, and vanishingly rare in crustaceans. The closest comparisons in the invertebrate literature tend to be certain coral shrimp, some cleaner shrimp, and a handful of ostracod species. The lisiosquilloid mantis shrimp are, by some measures, one of the best documented examples of this pattern outside the vertebrates, and the fact that they are found in the same taxonomic order as the peacock mantis shrimp, arguably the archetype of solitary animal violence, is a small but real anomaly in how we tend to categorize the social behavior of small sea creatures. A related piece of the stomatopod's social repertoire deserves a mention because it extends the picture in an unexpected direction. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Sheila Patek and Roy Caldwell, working with Hemisquila californiensis, a large stomatopod that lives in muddy burrows off the Southern California coast, made a small discovery that the field had not been expecting. The animals produced sound. The sounds were low frequency, in the range of 20 to 60 hertz, at the lower end of what humans can hear, and strongly dominated by a fundamental frequency with a secondary harmonic. The team published the recordings in 2006 in Marine and Freshwater Behavior and Physiology and gave the sounds a descriptive name. They called them rumbles because the closest acoustic analogy in the animal kingdom, in spectral structure and frequency band, turned out to be the low-frequency contact calls made by African and Asian elephants. A stomatopod rumble played back at a frequency shifted into a more easily audible range sounds startlingly like an elephant. It is produced by contracting a specific muscle that attaches to a stiff extension of the carapace, causing the carapace itself to vibrate at low frequency in a way that propagates through the surrounding water. Only the males produce the rumble. It is typically accompanied by a visual display. The animal's colored merle patches vibrate as the rumble is generated, and it appears to be part of the animal's territorial and possibly courtship signaling repertoire. Subsequent fieldwork by Erica Starterman and others in Patek's laboratory recorded these rumbles in the wild using hydrophone arrays placed in Hemisquila colonies. The recordings showed that the rumble was a consistent part of the acoustic environment of a healthy stomatopod burrow field, a low periodic hum at the edge of perception, produced by males advertising their presence to neighbors in a frequency range that carries well through water and that is, incidentally, outside the hearing range of most of the local fish. Like the circular polarization, the rumble is a communication channel optimized for the audience it is intended for and apparently invisible to much of the rest of the community. The animal has, in other words, a voice. It is not a voice most people have ever heard, because it operates below the threshold of casual perception, but it is a voice, and it is used. Put all of this together across a quiet moment, and what accumulates is a picture that does not match the popular one. The popular mantis shrimp is a small, violent spectacle, a spring-loaded weapon with colorful eyes, briefly viral, best admired from behind aquarium glass. The real mantis shrimp across the family at large includes that animal, and also includes an animal that pairs for life in a burrow in the sand, an animal that provisions its mate before itself, an animal that sings at low frequency in a channel its predators cannot hear, an animal that recognizes individual neighbors, an animal that fights by honest rules when it fights at all, and an animal that can keep track of its way home across a featureless reef by reading the sun through several meters of water. The weapon is part of it. So is the voice. So is the burrow. So are the 20 years in the dark in a university tank in Berkeley with the same partner, eating what the other one has brought back, tending to young, and doing all of this in a way that, if the observer lets themselves see it plainly, looks a great deal like living. The tanks at Berkeley do not go dark at night. The lab lights dim, but there is always some residual illumination. The two animals in the old pair retreat when the day's activity winds down into the deepest part of their shared burrow, where the light does not quite reach. What they do there, across the long hours until the next feeding, is a question that cannot be answered from outside the burrow. They are together, as they have been together for more than 20 years, in a space they have shaped to fit the two of them. The rest is theirs. The question of what will happen to these animals across the next several decades is less clear than most people who have followed their story would probably guess. On the surface, the mantis shrimp is not in the kind of obvious trouble that makes its way into conservation headlines. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the body that maintains the standard list of at-risk species, has not placed any of the commonly studied stomatopods on its threatened or endangered lists. The peacock mantis shrimp is not considered endangered. Lisiosquilina maculata is not considered endangered. Neogonodactylus oerstedii is not considered endangered. Most of the species whose names have come up in this story are classified, when they are classified at all, as being of least concern or as having insufficient data for a formal assessment. Mantis shrimp do not appear in the conservation press in the way that coral reefs do, or sea turtles do, or the more charismatic reef fish do. The popular impression, if there is one, is that they are doing fine. The closer you look, the less accurate that impression becomes. Every species of mantis shrimp that has been studied at all carefully is, at some point in its life history, dependent on coral reef habitat or on the sandy back reef environments that coral reefs create. The smasher species live in crevices in live rock, in the structural complexity that healthy coral builds over decades and centuries. The spearer species live in the sandy floors of the back reef, in U-shaped burrows that they maintain in sediment that is itself produced slowly by the continuous erosion of the coral structures behind them. The lisiosquiloid pairs that we have just described, the ones holding their burrows for 20 years at a time, are holding those burrows in sand fields whose existence is entirely dependent on the continued presence of the reef system that generates and sustains the sand. If the reef goes, the sand field eventually goes too. The animal's entire way of life is tied to an ecosystem that is currently in the middle of the largest and fastest collapse in the recorded history of coral reefs. The causes of that collapse are now familiar enough that I will mention them only briefly. Ocean temperatures have risen faster across the last 4 decades than coral reefs as a system have shown any capacity to adapt to. Marine heat waves, once rare, now occur with enough frequency that many reefs in the Indo-Pacific and the Caribbean are experiencing repeated bleaching events spaced closer together than the time required for the coral to recover between them. Ocean acidification, the gradual lowering of seawater pH that accompanies atmospheric carbon dioxide uptake, is, over a longer time frame, weakening the ability of coral to build the calcium carbonate skeletons that the whole reef structure depends on. Local stressors, from runoff and sedimentation to overfishing of the reef's grazing species, compound the global stresses. The result is that many of the specific reefs where stomatopod research has been conducted over the last 30 years are, as physical environments, no longer the same reefs they were when the research started. The habitat the animals inhabit is thinning underneath them. On top of the habitat problem sits a second pressure, narrower but more acute. The peacock mantis shrimp and several of the more colourful smaller species are prized in the marine aquarium trade. They are collected, often in large numbers, from Indo-Pacific reefs and shipped to hobbyist markets in Europe and North America and East Asia. Some of this collection is done by traditional hand capture methods that do not do much damage to the reef beyond the removal of the individual animal. A great deal of it is done in the parts of the trade that are harder to regulate, with sodium cyanide, a chemical that is squirted into the reef structure to stun animals so that they can be easily collected. The cyanide does not affect only the target animal. It kills or damages most of the live coral and most of the smaller invertebrates in the affected area. Mantis shrimp collected this way may arrive in aquariums looking healthy, but the reef patch they came from has often been structurally destroyed in the act of taking them. Maya DeVries, a stomatopod researcher at San Jose State University who has worked extensively on this issue, has described cyanide collection as probably the single most damaging pressure on mantis shrimp populations in the regions where the practice is common. The animals that survive collection end up as pets or as pest animals in home aquariums. The reef that produced them does not grow back on any meaningful timescale. A third pressure, less often discussed in the popular coverage, is the bycatch of industrial shrimp trawling in tropical coastal waters. Stomatopods, particularly smaller species in shallow sediment environments, are caught in very large numbers in shrimp trawls. They are usually not the target. The target is commercial penny-eyed shrimp, which are what you buy in a supermarket, and the stomatopod catch is discarded overboard, dead or dying. In certain trawl fisheries along the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Indo-Pacific, mantis shrimp make up a substantial fraction of the total catch by weight. Most of that catch is waste. The populations affected are, in many cases, populations that have never been formally studied, and whose demographic responses to this level of continuous removal are simply not known. Put these three pressures together: habitat degradation, targeted aquarium collection, and trawl bycatch, and the picture is not quite the least concern that the conservation databases suggest. It is more that the relevant assessments have not been done at the level of detail that would be needed to reach a confident conclusion. The data are thin, and the data collection has not kept up with the changes in the oceans where the animals live. We do not, in most cases, know how many mantis shrimp of a given species are alive right now, how that number compares to the number that were alive 20 years ago, or what trajectory the population is on. We know that their habitat is getting worse. We know that they are being taken in numbers that are hard to estimate. We know that nobody is keeping a careful watch in any comprehensive way on what the sum of these pressures is doing to the animals at the species level. What will happen to mantis shrimp across the next century depends on a great many things that nobody is currently measuring. This is not a counsel of despair, it is, more accurately, a counsel of honest uncertainty. The animals have survived larger catastrophes. Stomatopods as a lineage came through the Permian extinction that killed something like 90% of all marine species on Earth 250 million years ago. They came through the Cretaceous-Paleogene impact that ended the non-avian dinosaurs. They came through the smaller mass extinctions at the end of the Triassic and the end of the Ordovician. The lineage has demonstrated across 340 million years a resilience that few other animal groups can match. What is happening to the oceans now is serious and should be taken seriously, and the specific reef species we have been following through this story may well decline significantly before the current environmental shifts stabilize. But the probability that the Stomatopoda as an order survives this is, based on the fossil record alone, very high. Whether any given species survives is a different question. Whether the peacock mantis shrimp in particular, or the Berkeley pear's wild relatives in particular, or the small Neogonodactylus species whose navigation we have just been describing in particular, persist in numbers that allow continued scientific study. These are open questions, and will stay open for at least another generation. What the animals have contributed to human knowledge across the last half-century of serious research is worth taking stock of before we go much further. The scientific output from this small group of animals has been disproportionate to their size. The biomechanics of the strike have reshaped our understanding of latch-mediated spring actuation in biological systems, and the industrial applications of that understanding in composite materials, in impact-resistant armor, in prosthetic joints, in high-speed mechanical components for aerospace and automotive use, are genuine. The composite material work inspired by the Dactyl Club has produced commercial products funded by hundreds of millions of dollars of research investment and has contributed to the development of helmets and body armor that are, at this point, in field use. The phononic shielding work, still less than a year old, is expected to do something similar for acoustic and vibration damping technology across the next decade. On the sensory side, the Mantis shrimp eye has inspired a generation of engineered polarization-sensitive cameras which are now being used for medical imaging applications, including the detection of cancerous tissue, which turns out to have polarization signatures that healthy tissue lacks. The animal's color processing strategy, with its emphasis on rapid identification over fine discrimination, has informed discussions in computer vision and in the design of spectral imaging systems. The circular polarization optics have inspired a range of experimental data storage and encryption technologies. For a small crustacean, this is a substantial bequest to human engineering. On the biological side, the animal has contributed to the dismantling of several ideas that the scientific community held with more confidence than was warranted. The assumption that invertebrate brains do not carry structures comparable to those of insects is now in revision. The assumption that color vision always works by comparing photoreceptor signals is now in revision. The assumption that sophisticated spatial navigation requires a vertebrate-grade cognitive apparatus is now in revision. The assumption that high-impact biological weapons require separate armor systems to protect the user is now in revision. Each of these revisions is modest on its own. Cumulatively, they describe a scientific field that has been updating its basic pictures across the last 2 decades, driven largely by what this one order of animals has turned out to be doing. There is a thought worth pausing on at this stage of the story, which is the natural place for it to arrive. Most of what we have discussed about this animal has been relatively recent in the scientific sense. The mushroom bodies were confirmed in 2017. The navigation work ran from roughly 2015 through 2021. The circular polarization signaling work was published in 2015, almost a decade after the initial optical characterization. The phononic shielding was confirmed last year. Much of the color vision reframing happened inside the last 15 years. The biomechanical work on the club went through its most intense phase in the 2000s and early 2010s. Take a generous framing and call it 50 years of serious attention from the 1970s onward, during which the Mantis shrimp has been transformed in the scientific literature from a little-studied tropical curiosity into one of the better documented small predators in the animal kingdom. 50 years. The animal has been doing all of this. The strike, the cavitation, the phononic filtering, the 12-channel color system, the circular polarization signaling, the path integration, the mushroom body-based memory, the monogamy, the low-frequency rumble for 126 million years at minimum for the smasher-specific parts, and for upwards of 340 million years for the baseline stomatopod body plan. The animal was fully equipped with most of its current capacities before any vertebrate had evolved into anything recognizable as a mammal. The animal was fully equipped before flowering plants existed. The animal was fully equipped while the last dinosaurs were still alive. Across all of that time, the behaviors and the structures we have been describing were simply part of how the animal got through its day. The animal did not know they were there. The animal did not need to know. The facts of the Mantis shrimp's life were being lived on reefs that came and went and came back again during mass extinctions and recoveries, during the rise and fall of entire ecosystems for a length of time that our species is only beginning to have the tools to measure. Our own situation, by contrast, is this. We have been a species, in any recognizable anatomical sense, for about 300,000 years. We have been writing things down for about 5,000. We have had microscopes for about 400. We have had high-speed cameras for about 100. We have had the specific instruments that allowed us to measure the mantis shrimp's cavitation temperatures, its circular polarization sensitivity, and its phononic band gaps for fewer years than many of us have been alive. We arrived at this animal late. We arrived at it with equipment and vocabulary that the animal has been using without vocabulary, without equipment, without ever thinking about it, for a period of time that no human imagination can accommodate. We are catching up to what the animal already is. And we are doing the catching up during a window in which the oceans in which the animal lives are changing faster than they have changed at any point during the animal's evolutionary history. There is a grim symmetry to this. We have in the last 50 years finally begun to see the mantis shrimp for what it actually is, and in the same period we have begun to significantly degrade the reefs and the sediments and the waters that the mantis shrimp depends on. The understanding and the damage are arriving together. What we will do with the understanding, and whether we will have reef enough left to continue learning from the animal across the next 50 years, is now an open question. It is one of the few places in this story where the answer is not going to come from the animal. The answer will come from us. There is a last image I want to leave you with, and it is not the peacock mantis shrimp at Lemba, though she is still there. It is not Tyson, whose story ended long ago. It is not even Odin, the zebra mantis shrimp still quietly living his life at the Sea Life Centre in Great Yarmouth, spearing small fish from the mouth of his plastic burrow. It is the Berkeley pair, the two animals in the tank at the University of California, Berkeley, holding their long U-shaped burrow. Not doing anything dramatic, not hunting, not fighting, not striking, not signalling. Simply being a pair. The male somewhere near the burrow entrance, watching the water. The female somewhere inside, tending to whatever needs tending. Both animals aware, in whatever modest sense a small crustacean can be aware of such things, of each other's presence. Both animals, over the slow arithmetic of more than 20 years, having shared essentially every day of their adult lives with each other. An arrangement of two creatures that, by the understanding most people carry of what a mantis shrimp is, should not be possible, and is. They are the end of the story I wanted to tell you tonight. They are not the end of any story of their own. They will continue, in that burrow in that tank, doing what they do. When one of them dies, the other will probably hold the burrow alone for the rest of its life. Somewhere on a reef that the lab's researchers have never been to, a pair of wild Lysioscelina maculata will be doing the same thing. Two animals, one burrow, one shared life, in a piece of ocean that neither of them will ever leave. And somewhere on the same reef, the smashers will be striking their clams, the peacocks will be arming their springs and watching the water column with their independent eyes. The small Neogonodactylus will be reading the sun through the water above them to find their way home. And the whole ancient, intricate, quietly astonishing project that began 340 million years ago will be continuing. Whether any of it is still there, in numbers that a future researcher can find, when the children who are alive today have grandchildren of their own, is a question I do not know the answer to. I hope it is. It would be an unusual kind of loss to fail this particular animal now, after it has spent so long showing us what it is. For tonight, it is enough to know that somewhere, as you are listening, the animal is there. It is in a burrow, or on a rock, or in a tank in a lab. It is carrying, in one small armoured body, more than most of us imagined was possible. It is not watching you. It is not thinking of you. It has its own day to get through, and it is getting through it in the same way its ancestors have been getting through their days for longer than the word year has meant anything. You do not owe it your attention. But if at some point in your life the chance comes to give it your attention, to watch an animal like this for a minute, quietly, without requiring it to be spectacular, I can tell you from the long, patient work that has gone into understanding it, that minute will not be wasted. Somewhere right now, a mantis shrimp is at the mouth of its burrow. 3 pseudo-pupils in each of its 2 independent eyes. A spring loaded in each of its folded appendages. A set of memories it cannot tell you about and does not need to, stored in a brain the size of a grain of rice. It is a long way from you. It is not as far as you think. Good night.